This is Sakazuki, one of the most hated characters in all of the One Piece for all of the right reasons, as well as one of the mega beings set up to be a final saga antagonist. A man of extremely high expectations that we're going to examine because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the Donut Factory, Sakazuki. Alright, let's clear one thing up right at the get-go because I get this question a lot whenever I speak about this dude. He's known as both Sakazuki and Akainu, the former of which is his real name and the latter of which is his Admiral epithet, which he no longer carries because he's a fleet admiral now, hence why I just use his real name, so you don't have to leave your confused comments now. But Sakazuki has a very unique introduction because he's introduced through a character who is not him. In chapter 319, we catch our first glimpse of a Sakazuki-esque silhouette as we are made aware of the concept of the 3 Marine Admirals, to which Nico Robin states, even at Navy headquarters there are only 3 who hold the rank of Admiral: Akainu, Aokiji, Kizaru. The world government calls these 3 the ultimate military force. And from here to some degree, Sakazuki's introduction is directly linked to that of Kuzan, as is Kizaru's, because these 3 admirals are a package deal. In pre-time skip One Piece, they are a collective, which is why the first time that we see Sakazuki outside of a flashback is the iconic triple throne shot of the 3 admirals waiting for the Whitebeard pirates. As far as One Piece villains go, it's kind of an underwhelming first panel, but at the same time, he didn't need more than that, because by the time we actually saw Sakazuki, we'd experienced the terror of 2 other admirals. On Long Ring Long Land with a single hand, Kuzan froze the ocean as far as the eye could see. And when it came to fight battling, our monster trio of Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji didn't even look like they belonged in the same series as him. This was like watching Goku go up against the Simpsons. In no universe were the Straw Hats coming out of this with anything but utter defeat, which re-established the power ceiling of the One Piece world, because remember that at this point, Luffy had just beaten the closest thing we'd ever seen to a god on Skypiea. So here Luffy was immediately and brutally grounded. He was an insect in comparison to an admiral, and whatever one admiral is capable of, you can immediately assume that the others can do as well, which went on to be very true, as we would have a frighteningly similar experience on Sabaody Archipelago, where the supernovas were decimated by Admiral Kizaru, who also went on to be the cause of the eradication of the Straw Hat Pirates. All of this was in service of laying the foundation for Sakazuki, because we've now encountered 2 admirals, both of which were capable of soloing the crew, and one of them who actually succeeded in breaking them up. So ultimately, Sakazuki is the last but not least admiral to be showcased because he took everything that Kuzan and Kizaru built and made them look like we'd been playing the game on easy mode. And here we're not just talking about power, although it is worth mentioning. Sakazuki is of course the wielder of what has been described by author Eiichiro Oda as the devil fruit capable of conjuring the highest level of offensive power, which is the Malgu Malgu no Mi, a Logia type that allows Sakazuki to conjure, manipulate, and become magma, which is an instant win against 99.9% of One Piece characters, even accounting for those with Haki. But that aspect is not the most daunting part of Sakazuki. What makes him truly dangerous and a landmark antagonist for One Piece is his belief, which is why our first taste of Sakazuki doesn't involve any fighting at all. During Robin's flashback, we briefly see Sakazuki as a vice admiral, making the decision to destroy an evacuation ship full of innocent civilians. At the time, the island of Ohara was subject to a Buster call because some scholars on the island were conducting some very naughty taboo research, and Sakazuki's logic for killing everyone was, if by chance even a single scholar is hiding out in that ship, all this sacrifice will be for naught. You must destroy evil at its very roots. And this is the philosophy of absolute justice, specifically Sakazuki's sub-brand Thorough Justice. Sakazuki is a justice perfectionist, which I think is best observed by Kobe during the Paramount War, where after the Marines had achieved victory, the war continued, with Kobe stating, "This victory has only whetted their appetites." Sakazuki wasn't going to stop until he had kill-murdered every last individual pirate on this battlefield, because letting even one of them live would not be stopping evil at its roots. That one escaped pirate would then go on to regrow and spread assorted evils all over the world again. Those are the brain thoughts of Sakazuki. And the reason why this man is so terrifyingly competent is because Sakazuki has a level of belief that rivals and perhaps even surpasses that of Luffy. Luffy's ideology is at least malleable to some extent. He's open to suggestions sometimes, but Sakazuki is not. There is no negotiating with him, and from his perspective, there is always a clear path to justice. And that path, generally involves your death. Because even if you're on his side, he expects others to embody his determination. During the Paramount War, Sakazuki encountered a Marine fleeing the battlefield because he had a family to take care of, and he was scared of leaving them alone. And in response, Sakazuki said, "If you care about your family, then and die an honorable death before straight up murdering the dude. Think about that. The first living person attacked by Sakazuki in this war wasn't a pirate, wasn't a prisoner, wasn't a revolutionary, it was one of his own allies. But that's not how Sakazuki sees it. From his perspective, that ally was every bit as bad as an enemy because he wasn't prepared to enact the justice, meaning that he was likely to allow a root of evil to escape and thus making the sacrifice of Marineford ultimately meaningless. And look, I do believe that this hyper brutality does come from a genuine place of wanting to do good. Looking at the only image we currently have of Sakazuki as a child, he had quite a rough upbringing. This kid probably isn't even in double digits, and he's already fighting for his life with a knife and what looks like blood stains all over his shorts, something that got censored from the officially animated version of this that we saw in the end credits of One Piece Film Z. It's a really creepy image. And you know, something that works well in horror is using children as a vehicle for the main monster, because it represents that ultimate corruption of innocence. And I see that on full display with Child Sakazuki, which only becomes infinitely more creepier when you see a whole squad of Child Sakazuki lined up in ranks ready to completely dismantle every part of you. So you let me know in the comments, how many Child Sakazukis do you think you could take in a fight? Because for the record, I don't think I could take any. But something interesting that you may or may not have noticed is that Sakazuki doesn't smile. And you know, that's kind of a big deal in One Piece, which thematically often boils down to a battle of smiles. In fact, Luffy's toughest opponents are often the ones who can smile just as wide as he can, which is a direct challenge to his ideology and his role as the Joy Boy. You've got a whole bunch of twisted Joy Boys running around trying to construct the world in their own image, but Sakazuki, weirdly enough, isn't one of them. And I think that's because he sees himself as a sacrificial piece, someone determined to build the perfect world, but with the knowledge that he won't be worthy of living in it. Although I should point out that he has smiled at one time, which was in response to Whitebeard telling him to stick to lighting candles on a birthday cake. A very funny joke. But that's the only time he's ever done that in the manga. I don't know about the anime, I don't keep track of all the smiles in the anime. Sometimes they add smiles. Very bad of them. But even then in the manga, this smile didn't even crack Sakazuki's top lip. So whatever happened to Sakazuki as a child was not justice. And this is now him arguably overcompensating just a little bit to make sure that such injustice never happens to anyone else again. And as for who that anyone else could specifically be, it's heavily speculated that Commander Hibari is Sakazuki's daughter for a whole ton of reasons that I'm not going to go into here, but I do have a full video on the topic if you're interested. With the ultimate conclusion being the idea that Sakazuki is trying to build that perfect world for his daughter to live in, and he's willing to personally enact any means so long as he reaches that endpoint. Again, to be clear, that is all speculation at this stage. But there is something like that driving Sakazuki. Most villains in One Piece tend to be a bit broken in some way, like say Crocodile and Gecko Moria, who failed to achieve their dreams and now being dicks as a result. But Sakazuki, scarily, is a man well on the path to his ambition, and who will not falter in the quest to find his own personal One Piece. Something very much recognized by Oda, who once used him as an example of what not to do when creating a main protagonist. Oda said, "When creating a character, one needs to be careful not to make them too strong. For example, if Akainu was the main character, the series wouldn't last a year because the dude has everything. Maximum punch fighting power and relentless belief in what he's doing." And you know, if there's one panel that always haunts me, it's near the end of Marineford, where Sakazuki is still relentlessly approaching Ace with a massive chunk of his body missing, depicting him as this unstoppable Terminator-like existence. And you know, there was a point at the climax of Marineford where Sakazuki was taking on Jinbei, Crocodile, and all of the Whitebeard commanders at once, and they still couldn't stop him. In the end, it took the Deus Ex Machina of Shanks arriving at Marineford for Luffy to be capable of surviving this encounter. And it's worth mentioning that Shanks being there wasn't originally planned. It was a very last-minute decision by Oda, and I think a huge chunk of that was that he couldn't figure out any other way to logically have Luffy survive against such an overwhelming enemy. And I do consider Sakazuki to be the main antagonist of Marineford. I mean, technically, then Fleet Admiral Sengoku is in charge of the battle, but Sakazuki is the one truly taking command. He was the one keeping the Marines in line by instilling them with the fear of absolute justice. He was the one screwing over the Whitebeard pirates by concocting plots to turn their allies against them, like the Squad situation. And he was the one fighting on the front lines with the incredible bravery of being willing to take on an Emperor of the Sea 1v1, and quite successfully as well. Because what this event establishes that in terms of raw power, Sakazuki is pretty incredibly close to the ceiling. And one of my favorite panels in this arc is where Whitebeard is raising his weapon and Sakazuki just steps on it and says, "Nah, mate," because it gives me the same sort of vibe as Luffy stopping Doflamingo from killing Law with his foot. And of course, Sakazuki then goes on to establish himself as one of the most most hated yet most effective antagonists in One Piece by actually killing Podcast D Ace, and not through power but by through clever mind tactics, which is something that Sakazuki doesn't get anywhere near enough credit for. He is intelligent AF. People tend to think of him as a big chonky magma punch man, but his words are far more effective than any physical attack he could conjure. In so many key situations, he always seems to know the exact right thing to say to attain the outcome he desires. And in the case of Podcast D Ace, Sakazuki emotionally deconstructed him in an instant by hitting on that point of cowardice and accusing Ace of running away. He also went on to shockingly efficiently insult both Whitebeard and Roger, thus opening up Ace's colossal closet of daddy issues, and dismantling Ace mentally before ultimately dismantling him physically. If Sakazuki hadn't known the exact right thing to say at the exact right time, then I believe that Ace would still be alive today. So he's intimidating on all fronts. There is no character flaw to exploit, at least not that we're currently aware of. He has top tier strength, intelligence, and willpower. He's the very most you could ask for in an antagonist in this world, which is only emphasized when Sakazuki is promoted to Fleet Admiral, and post-time skip Jinbei makes the following comment. Under Fleet Admiral Sakazuki's leadership, Navy headquarters has grown far more powerful and determined than ever before. However, this is where my personal praise of Sakazuki starts to significantly slow down, because Sakazuki's post-time skip role has been a bit disappointing in comparison to his pre-time skip showcase, at least so far. We actually do see him quite frequently, usually between arcs. However, he's always doing one of three things. He's either complaining at his desk, in the middle of a meeting, or taking a phone call, sometimes mixing the three options together for some spicy variety. But essentially, it's been almost 15 years since the time skip in our real world time. People have started and finished high school 2.5 times over, and in that time, Sakazuki hasn't really done anything. I will say that I do like the commentary of leadership, the idea that Sakazuki is a very frontline kind of guy who was always frustrated by the lack of direct actions being taken by the Marines and the world government, and then after attaining the authority to take that action, he finds himself buried in bureaucracy and resource management to the point where the Marines have barely had any action post-time skip at all. At least not until recently. Now they're getting too much action. But there's definitely something there that I appreciate. I just don't know if it takes 15 years to make that point. And to be as fair as I can be, this wasn't intentional by Oda. One Piece is a series that just keeps ballooning out of control, and given that Sakazuki is reserved as a final saga villain, he's accidentally being kept waiting by everything else that Oda wanted to do in the meantime. And it was really nice to see him back in action fighting against Bartholomew Kuma on the top of the Red Line, that very brief moment, but it also reminded me of what I'd really been missing from him. However, my biggest criticism of Sakazuki is how he gets used in extended media, because in the post-time skip era of One Piece, Sakazuki's primary role isn't even in the actual story. In the One Piece franchise, his main role has been a marketing tool for the films. So weirdly enough, apart from the Straw Hat, Sakazuki is the character who appears most in the One Piece movies. He's in Film Z, Film Gold, Stampede, and Film Red, and the trailers and marketing material always make this out to be a big deal. Like, look how big this movie film is. Even Fleet Admiral Sakazuki is in it. This is going to be big, world-changing stuff. But without fail, on each and every occasion, he's in the movie for all of 30 seconds if he's lucky, usually monologuing from his desk about what's happening in the movie and providing nothing of substance other than sending one of his subordinates to go and actually be involved in the movie. And I'm a lot less forgiving about this than I am with his role in the manga, which, to be fair, in the manga he's doing essentially the same thing. But in this case, it's the franchise extracting every last drop of goodwill that Sakazuki still has from the pre-time skip era, which again ended almost 15 years ago. He's not getting these cameo appearances to enhance the film. He's getting them so that they can slap his face in the trailer and pretend he's going to do something. They're tricking you to paying money. And for some contrast, another character that this happens to is Admiral Kizaru, who appears in Film Z, Stampede, and Film Red. However, unlike Sakazuki, he's actually important and has major fights in 2 of those 3 movies, one of which was against Shanks. So Kizaru is such a boss and a fantastic addition to the films, which is the sort of thing that you want from Sakazuki when you see him in the trailers. And look, the only reason why I'm lingering on this point for so long is because post-time skip, there's just not a lot else to say about Sakazuki yet in canon material. Realistically, he has almost as many film appearances as he does series canon appearances. So the movies make up a stupidly large chunk of Sakazuki content, which is a big mark against him. I feel like I've personally been quite patient. We've been in this post-time skip era, again, I'm gonna say it again, for almost 15 years now, and I just want to see the guy do a thing. But that does lead us to the very important point that Sakazuki is an incomplete villain. The first that we've examined on this tier list. Everything we've seen of him so far is a glorified introduction, and a final judgment does need to be reserved for when we do eventually substantially dive into him, which means that we probably won't have a definitive judgment until the very end of One Piece. And given that that's not now, we do need to take that into account and cut him a bit of slack. I do think that by the end of One Piece, Sakazuki will shed the desk and return to his Marineford prime, if not greater, and establish himself as one of, and potentially even the best antagonist in the series, but that day is not today. And I think that the best I can do for him right now is an A tier, which is earned almost exclusively through the Marineford arc alone. But I can't wait to see his full potential as an antagonist, and I have no doubt that we will be revisiting this ranking a couple of years down the line. But for now, you let me know in the comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next. This is Rob Lucci. His hobbies include carpentry, knitting, force-feeding magical fruits to co-workers, and of course, vicious kill murdering. And Mr. Rob Lucci also happens to be one of the premier villains of the One Piece. But how premier do you ask him is? Maybe? Well, we're gonna find out. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the literal cat in the hat, Rob Lucci. So here's a fun thing. Rob Lucci is, I think, the only primary antagonist we're going to examine who was at one point a Straw Hat candidate. The opening of Water 7 was that the Going Merry needed to be repaired and that the Straw Hats needed a shipwright, so we go to Water 7. We meet a bunch of ship make work people, and we know that one of them is going to be our next crew member, and Mr. Rob Lucci at the time was on that list. We didn't know at the time that he was a secret agent planted by the world government to find some drawings of a very big boat on paper stored within a cyborg. No, Oda very deliberately deceived us when it comes to this man. The first panel of Rob Lucci in the series is without question the single most unremarkable first panel of any primary antagonist in One Piece. It is simply this tiny sliver of Rob Lucci who looks so purposely unremarkable, sandwiched between two other Galileo carpenters working away. The first time you see Lucci, you don't even see Lucci. It's like reading a story by a magician. Everything needed for the trick is right there in plain sight, but the author is able to command your attention so powerfully that you don't even see it. Even in Lucci's first full body panel, yes, he clearly stands out in retrospect because we know who he is, but at the time, the attention primarily goes to Paulie, because he has a more intricate, how shall we say, main character design, with assorted bright colors as opposed to the rest of Galileo, and Paulie's color scheme was very deliberately designed by Oda, because in that very same chapter, Luffy had previously declared his intention to acquire a shipwright and then drew a masterwork depicting Frankie, but we didn't know that at the time. All we knew is that Luffy wanted someone vaguely blue, and Paulie's primary color scheme was also vaguely blue. There are things, ever so many teeny tiny things that Oda implemented in order to get the heat off of Lucci, because it's a very tricky thing to balance. Oda couldn't make Lucci too obscure or else the betrayal and revelation wouldn't be satisfying. No great mystery ends with the conclusion that it was the guy in the background of page 5 in chapter 323. So the real challenge here was to make Lucci both blend in and stand out. And Oda did this through the classic shonen device of quirk typecasting. In a lot of shonen series, authors develop one-trick characters who have an extremely odd quirk, like say Ghosh from Black Clover, whose only real characteristic is his obsession with his sister, or Lance from Marshall, who's obsessed with his sister, or Yuri from Spy Family, who's obsessed with his sister. Other character quirks are available, it doesn't always have to be mild incest, and Rob Lucci is a great example of this. Oda gave him the very bold quirk of ventriloquism via pigeon, which is so ridiculous that it disarms readers and viewers taking Rob Lucci in any way seriously, especially when Luffy comes to the conclusion that it is in fact the pigeon controlling Rob Lucci and not the other way around. So he's strong and helpful, but Lucci is very much painted as a gag character, a quirk typecast. And also any potential ominous vibes about him are masked by the internal conflict within the Straw Hats. There is so much going on during Water 7 with our focus on Robin, Usopp, and Frankie that Rob Lucci and the rest of CP9 masterfully weave their way into the story, and by the time that we even begin to suspect them, it is far too late. And there's also something extra special that needs to be added here, something that only really comes across in the anime. But when Robin is speaking to that CP9 member in the shadows, we just hear Lucci's natural voice. However, because he's been pretending to be a high-pitched pigeon, you can't even recognize it's his real voice. It's really well thought out, and it makes me want to see more mystery-style storytelling from Oda. Although I will say that there is one flaw with Oda's implementation of Rob Lucci as a super secret agent, and that flaw is that aside from Water 7, Rob Lucci and CP9 seem to be practically world famous. When Rob Lucci goes on his Bond villain monologue to Iceberg about the inner workings of Cypherpol, he states that CP9 is a secret cell that cannot operate in the open because it's not supposed to exist. It's a secret, don't tell anyone, shh. And this is skipping ahead a bit, but when Rob Lucci returns to any lobby, he's greeted like a celebrity. In fact, everywhere he goes, he's a celebrity. Every Marine and world government agent knows exactly who he is. Even the waitress that Jabra was dating named Catherine dumped Jabra because she heard that Rob Lucci was coming back to any lobby, and she wanted to try her luck with him instead. There's also a part during Thriller Bark where Gecko Moria and Bartholomew Kuma are talking about the Enies Lobby incident, with Kuma saying, and I quote, "Before the incident at Enies Lobby, no one thought that Rob Lucci could lose." Whereas the line should have been something more like, "Before the incident at Enies Lobby, no one knew that Rob Lucci even existed, because he's a secret agent man who infiltrated Water 7 using his real name, even though he is known by every fodder Marine and world government agent in existence." And after Luffy defeats Lucci, there's even a broadcast over what remains of Enies Lobby that Rob Lucci was beaten. And all of the Marines are in shock because they all know who he is. So I really do think that Oda dropped the ball a bit with the secret agent stuff after the reveal, but if he was to drop the ball, then that would be the time to do it. It still doesn't impact the reveal itself. And Lucci is a villain who has more or less managed to retain his initial air of mystery because over the course of One Piece, we don't actually learn a whole lot about him. In total, Rob Lucci's backstory amounts to about 5 panels. It's a chilling tale of a pirate crew having taken a kingdom soldier's hostage, and when Lucci was sent in to settle the situation, he infiltrated and killed all of the hostages before doing the same to the attacking pirates. So this flashback tends to confuse a lot of people, especially in the anime where the events are extended and portrayed in a bit weirdly. I'm not a huge fan of how they did it. But the reason why Lucci killed the hostages was because if these soldiers were weak enough to expose the country, then simply dealing with the pirates wasn't going to be good enough, as those same soldiers would just go on to compromise the kingdom again. Rob Lucci is a man who believes that weakness is a sin. In his eyes, these soldiers were every bit as guilty of not fulfilling their duties as the pirates were of attacking the kingdom to begin with. This is a philosophy that Rob Lucci has labeled dark justice, which is Lucci's personal brand of justice that involves finding a balance between the most horrific yet still logical solution to any problem. With something like absolute justice, Sakazuki will do terrible things that he sees as necessary for the greater good. He will not seek those things out though. Whereas with dark justice, Rob Lucci will deliberately seek out those terrible things that can result in justice. It's basically his excuse for being able to do horrible things. And Lucci is definitely one of the most stoic characters in One Piece. His ability to express any emotion is so limited that I'm convinced he's using Iron Body on his face at all times to keep everything perfectly frozen in a constant state of neutrality. And you know, in another saga, I'm not sure if a primary antagonist like Lucci would have landed, because Lucci is very dry and we learn incredibly little about him. However, it works for Water 7 and Enies Lobby because Lucci's role is bigger than any individual goal. Rob Lucci is a physical manifestation of the world government. He is there to serve as that unbreakable wall that the Straw Hats cannot overcome. And the metaphor is that trying to fight Rob Lucci is like trying to fight the entirety of the world government itself. It is just impossible. More so than most, this is an arc where the Straw Hats are fighting against the system. And systems are emotionless and ruthless. They do what they're programmed to do. There is no emotional input. Like how when Caliphate stated that their long mission was nearly complete and Lucci simply replied, "Keep careless comments like that to yourself until we arrive." And one of the reasons why I personally really love Lucci is because Oda really commits to his no-nonsense persona. And really, the only occasion of nonsense that I can recall is Lucci being caught out underestimating Luffy's strength, after which point Lucci immediately recognized his own fault and adjusted. At one point, he even complimented Luffy and stated that he was worthy of being a captain, which was really refreshing to see, as most villains have a complete inability to self-reflect and often delegate their own shortcomings to other factors. Not Rob Lucci though. This man is a nigh-on flawless iron wall. You cannot crack him emotionally, and you cannot wait for him to make a mistake because he won't. And so the only way that you can deal with Lucci is to be strong enough to break down that iron wall, which is why Luffy versus Lucci is one of the most memorable fights in One Piece. It is a non-stop brutal slugfest that pushed Luffy harder than any other opponent, and even to this day, the only fight that can really rival it is Luffy versus Katakuri. And watching Luffy deliver that final jet Gatling gun that broke the big cat wall is still one of my fondest memories of One Piece of all time. But another reason why Lucci works here is because the emotional core of the Water 7 saga is about the Straw Hats. They have more than enough drama happening happening within their own crew that we can afford to balance all of that out with such an emotionless villain. But then there's also Spandam. I mentioned this in his video, but Spandam and Lucci are dual antagonists. What Lucci lacks in out loud personality, Spandam eagerly fills like a teenager into a sock. And what Spandam lacks in the threat of raw power, Lucci expertly serves up on the corpse of his enemy. There's even a great moment where you see the true contrast between Lucci and Spandam, which is when Lucci refuses to toast the success of their 5-year mission. I'm not interested in status or power. The world government decides justice for us. As long as the government recognizes you as the leader of CP9, we will carry out your orders to the letter, but we don't have to agree with your ideals. Which contrasts against Spandam because all he cares about is status and power, and also dictating justice according to his own ideals. But Spandam then asks what Lucci does want, and the reply is quite chilling. Blood. When we're here, murder is justified. And Oda even draws Lucci having transformed into his carnivorous Zoan form, which were previously stated to be subject to heightened primal instincts, bloodlust in particular. And I find it really interesting that Rob Lucci's only tangible desire in this world probably comes as a direct result of consuming his devil fruit. He wants to kill because that carnivorous Zoan instinct is always there driving him to that outcome. Although Rob Lucci does also have, a slight hint of sadism about him, which is displayed on the very first occasion that he actually smiled, which was when he was encouraging Kaku and Califer to eat their unknown devil fruits. Lucci just sits there and says, eat them, it'll be fun. Rob Lucci used the word fun. There is no other point in One Piece where the concept of fun would be even remotely applicable to him. But the thought of two people cursing themselves with unknown powers and contorting their bodies into God knows what is incredibly exciting to him. And when it comes down to it, Rob Lucci isn't too dissimilar from an animal in a zoo. He's happy so long as he gets fed. He might not agree ideologically with his zookeepers, but as long as they keep the red meat coming, it's not an issue. Which I will say is very odd for One Piece, given how much it focuses on the importance of willpower, no matter which side you're on. On paper, Lucci has the lowest willpower of any major antagonist. He has no real personal drive, he's endlessly loyal to the world government, he doesn't even care what they tell him to do, that's just justice. If they ask him to jump, he says how high. If they ask him to bake a cake, he says, what flavor? And if they ask him to whip out his in the jungle and that poison dart frog, then he says, that's just the kind of man that Rob Lucci is. He lets them decide everything for him. And yet he's still able to properly challenge and on a good day beat Monkey D. Luffy, the most driven, will-focused being in existence. So how is Rob Lucci this damn strong? Well, it's because the system isn't manipulating him. Rob Lucci is manipulating the system, which I think was brilliantly observed when Lucci revealed that Chimney and Gonbei had been following them. And when Spandam asked why Lucci didn't get rid of them, he replied, "You didn't give me the order," which was accompanied by his second smile in the series. Commanding Rob Lucci is like making a deal with the devil. He will carry out exactly what you ask him to the letter, but you need to be extremely careful with your requests, because if you give him even the tiniest loophole, then he is going to take that and exploit it in the worst possible way for you. Although Rob Lucci does come with a sliver of character growth over time. Following the Annie Slobby incident, CP9 escaped the island, and Rob Lucci, he is not in good shape at all, and in order to pay for his medical bills, the rest of the agents take up odd jobs in a town named St. Poplar. The agents do this because, as it turns out, they've all known each other since childhood. CP9 agents are taken to a secret training island from a very young age. And after Lucci's recovery, they show their thanks to the town by beating up some pirates who had attacked them. And this is where we see the aforementioned character development, because this same event happened in Rob Lucci's flashback, the one where he punished the kingdom for being weak enough to allow the pirates to attack. However, in this case, his motto of dark justice was switched to excessive justice, and Lucci only attacked the pirates, sparing the town, despite the fact that they were weak. And I think that this is because Lucci had to really reckon with his own philosophy after losing to Luffy. Because if he lost to Luffy, then that means that Lucci himself was weak. And according to his dark justice, he shouldn't even be worthy of living right now, because Lucci himself was weak enough to allow the Annie Slobby incident to happen. And while this is yet to be shown in any media, Oda has said that Lucci and the CP9 agents then went on to foil a plot to undermine the world government by Spandam's father Spandine, and that's how they were not only reinstated, but even promoted to CP0 agents. And for most of post-time skip, Lucci has been doing what Lucci does best. He's been ever present, but mostly hiding from us as readers. Lucci was aware of what was happening on Punk Hazard as he was watching Caesar's broadcast, and he actually made an appearance on Dressrosa at the end of that arc, before making himself properly known at the Reverie, which was a really fun time because Rob Lucci appeared every 10 volumes on the dot. Volume 70 for Punk Hazard, Volume 80 for Dressrosa, and then Volume 90 for the Reverie. Although sadly, the streak ended there. there. Because Lucci did appear during Wano, but unfortunately it was volume 102. It was a bit late there. He also made a ton of appearances in One Piece films, starting with film Gold, then Stampede, and was also featured in film Red, which actually makes him one of the most featured One Piece movie characters aside from the Straw Hats. And these are tiny appearances, but what they did right is they kept Rob Lucci remaining in the background of the story. He was continuing to be relevant. We didn't know what he was doing, but it wasn't good. And eventually we saw this not good as he reappeared as a minor antagonist during the Egghead Island arc. And the one thing I've come to really respect about Rob Lucci is that even after being beaten by Luffy, he wasn't broken. Most villains have their wills and dreams shattered by Luffy, but Lucci never lost focus. Instead, he became even stronger and worked his way up to a rematch with Luffy. And rematches in One Piece before this point were practically unprecedented. After being beaten by Luffy, no one challenges him again, except for Lucci. And Bellamy, I guess, but and I think this very strongly reflects Lucci's symbolism of the system. Yes, Rob Lucci was beaten, but the world government definitely was not. And as long as this system stands, so will he. And not only that, he'll get even stronger, now having awakened his devil fruit. However, 2 years on, Rob Lucci has become a bit more blatant about his interpretation of his orders, as he was clearly instructed not to attack Luffy due to him being an Emperor of the Sea, and Lucci's less than creative way of getting around this was to state that he doesn't consider Luffy to be an Emperor of the Sea. So it's definitely not his best work, but that's because Rob Lucci in this arc needed to reassert himself. This isn't mentioned very often, but Lucci had a Katakuri-esque legend around him. Within the Marines, he was known as a man who could not be defeated, and I think that Lucci himself definitely bought into that to some degree, which seems like a bit of a joke now because he wasn't even a Haki user pre-time skip, but that's how he was set up. He was the OG beta test for Katakuri. So on Egghead Island, Lucci now had the chance to defeat the only person who had ever beaten him and in essence reclaim his perfect record, which also means that for the first time we're aware of, Lucci fought for something other than bloodlust. There's a sense of pride on the line here, a drive to do better, a drive that led him to awakening his devil fruit. If anything, Luffy has brought out the best in Lucci by delivering that first taste of humility. And Lucci would of course be served 2 more courses during Egghead Island, as he was very much out of his league in the Luffy rematch, and his main conflict on the island ended up being against Zoro, who defeated Lucci with what I would describe as an uncomfortable degree of ease. As it's portrayed in the manga, the moment that Zoro got serious, Lucci was finished. Zoro didn't even whip out the bandana for this occasion. That's how unserious he was. Which is terrifying because I can only imagine how much more powerful this is going to make Lucci in the future. As we've explored, despite his willingness to obey, he's not the kind of man whose will can be broken. He's not going to retire and open up a cafe like previous One Piece villains. No, he's going to take these 2 losses and compound them into an even more ferocious opponent to deal with in the future. But there is one more very important thing to note about Lucci. When he was questioned by Marcus Mars, Lucci made a plea to spare Kaku's life, which is the first time that Rob Lucci has ever shown what I would describe as a typical human emotion. He was concerned for his friend, and it shows that he's found meaning in something other than bloodlust. I don't know how much meaning, but this simple request is such a huge step forward for Lucci. Which brings us to the current day and Rob Lucci's placement on this list. Although I still feel like Lucci has a lot left to offer us in the future. I often feel like if I examine Rob Lucci alone in comparison to other top tier One Piece villains, he ends up feeling a bit lacking, but the context of Lucci's tenure really matters. And within that context of the Water 7 saga, Rob Lucci is simply perfect. I don't know what more I would have wanted from someone in his position. And anything that is lacking is balanced out by Spandam. And you really get the same sort of vibe on Egghead Island. Rob Lucci was there, but he didn't have the presence of Saint Saturn or Kizaru, completely different weight classes, and yet he still did his job as a villain immaculately. And apart from the not so secret agent thing, which is mostly just funny, I struggle to find any flaws with Rob Lucci and his unbelievably impactful and persistent role as a villain in the story, and as such, he is going to be our 3rd S-tier villain on this list. And you let me know in the comments who you'd like to see ranked next. This is Kizaru, but no one cares about that because he is made out of light and you are not, which makes him one of the most impossible opponents to face in all of One Piece, and Kizaru occupies a position as one of the most prolific figures in the fictional Pirate Rogues gallery. How prolific, you ask, not realizing that you're speaking to a video that can't talk back to you? Well, we're gonna find out. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring a man whose penis is canonically made out of light, Kizaru. Those were Oda's words, not mine, by the way. I didn't want to know. Oda he's very loud with these things. I'm very excited about this video though. In fact, I've been eagerly anticipating the end of Egghead Island just so we could make this. Because Kizaru is my favorite Marine Admiral, and his introduction, it is incredibly understated. After Luffy punches St. Charles, we cut to the Holy Land of Marijois, where what we see is a middle-aged man getting up from his comfy chair and claiming that he'll be back right away. Usually Oda elects to introduce villains with a sort of intimidating silhouette, one that paints them as an immediate big bad threat that we need to be concerned with, and one that often goes on to be subverted by their actual design. You see the villain and it's like, oh, okay, I guess they're not actually that scary, but Kizaru, ooh, he's the opposite. Oda introduces him looking not so scary, and he turns out to be one of the most terrifyingly unstoppable antagonists we've ever encountered. The really scary thing about Kizaru is that Oda didn't feel the need to paint him as intimidating. Kizaru didn't need any artistic assistance to tell us how to feel about him. And a lot of the credit for this mainly goes to the introduction of Aokiji on Long Ring Longland, who already established the threat level of a Marine Admiral. So in that way, Kizaru didn't need any help. Just hearing his name was enough for readers and watchers to clench their very real buttholes in very fictional fear. But the most initially striking thing about Kizaru isn't any of the fear, it's not the power, it is his playfulness. He has a series of gags immediately attached to him, one of which is that he can never work his Denden Mushi no matter how many times he's been told. It's like trying to show my mother how to use any Bluetooth device. It's impossible. She just doesn't get it, and I've run out of ways to try and teach her. But Kizaru, he is so powerful that this lack of comprehension, it is irrelevant. Despite being able to move at what is effectively the speed of light, Kizaru is also incredibly slow and carefree. He runs on his own schedule, and in the anime in particular, his voice sounds rather sarcastic and can be quite demeaning depending on who he's talking to, which can even extend to world-class figures like Ben Beckman. During the Paramount War, when Beckman threatened Kizaru, this gave us the classic "whoa whoa" Ben Beckman line, which was just Kizaru messing around because he immediately and easily escaped. For the vast majority of One Piece, there has been nothing that even comes close to making Kizaru worry. There was even that one time where he offered to go to Wano when the Marines discovered that Big Mom was on her way there, and thus Kizaru is essentially offering to put himself in a position to be facing both Big Mom and Kaido. There is no person in this world who willingly volunteers to fight two Emperors of the Sea at once. No one except for this guy. And he does it all with a smile. Kizaru, he's always smiling. He's the epitome of live, laugh, love. And just as empty as that tired motivational phrase, as we will soon see. Back to Sabaody though. To Kizaru, this mission of punishing the worst generations that punch the dude, it's about on the same level as picking up some milk from the shops. And we see why, as one casual kick can cause more destruction than any single attack we'd seen in the series to this point. To the Straw Hats at this stage, Kizaru is effectively a god. He descended from the heavens of the Holy Land. He controls light. He moves at what is inaccurately referred to, but is effectively light speed. And he can regenerate from what little damage anyone is actually capable of inflicting on him. There's also a very interesting metric used during this arc that relates to Kizaru, which is when Shaki states that Silver's Rayleigh is about 100 times stronger than the supernovas on the archipelago. At the time, this sounds like an exaggeration, but it turns out to be a scarily accurate measurement, and it puts Kizaru into some pretty clear perspective. Because it took Silver's Rayleigh to stop him, and not comfortably either. In fact, Kizaru seems quite confident in his chances against Rayleigh, meaning that Kizaru is at least 100 times stronger than Luffy at this stage. And that number is not lost on Luffy. His goal after meeting Kizaru is to become that 100 times stronger. And he will drop that specific number much later on in the series. But Kizaru's role as main antagonist of the Sabaody arc is one of a horror movie villain. You cannot fight him, you can only run and hope not to be his next victim as he decimates every figure unfortunate enough to be caught in his path. And while this isn't immediately apparent, he does have an incredibly imposing physical presence as well. I'd say the first time that we really feel this is when we see Kizaru standing near Basil Hawkins. He is a colossal human and visually elevated to the godlike status that matches his power. And he is arguably one of, if not the single most impactful main antagonist in One Piece. Because Kizaru is responsible for the destruction of the Straw Hat Pirates. He is the one and only challenge that has caused this crew to crumble, resulting in the iconic speech of the series narrator. Grove 12, Sabaody Archipelago, the Grand Line. That day, the Straw Hat Pirates led by Captain Monkey D. Luffy were eradicated. Kizaru changed the course of the entire series. The Straw Hats as we knew them ceased to exist after encountering him. We were now 500 chapters into this journey, and all of a sudden we were reading a completely different story, following Luffy alone and into the unknown. So when it comes to the arc that he was put in charge of, Kizaru did a better job than any other villain in every area we could have asked for. In fact, there's only 2 other antagonists in the series that have managed to scar Luffy with the depth that Kizaru managed to inflict, and they would be Blackbeard and Sakazuki, whose combination of actions led to the death of Ace. But so far, Kizaru is the perfect villain, full marks. But there's a lot more to Kizaru that we've mined in the 15 years since this event. As a Marine Admiral, Kizaru of course has his own personal philosophy of justice, which is unclear justice. A philosophy so vague yet so clearly stated, as Kizaru has it written in large characters behind him in his office. Unclear justice is extremely difficult to define, and that's on purpose. It's because of Kizaru's own refusal to do so. According to Kizaru's Vegapunk databook entry, he elected to adopt unclear justice so that he doesn't have to particularly think or even care about what he does. Kizaru's justice is unclear because he himself has no vision of justice, which is quite sad because it also means that he has no personal hopes and dreams for the future. Kizaru has even referred to himself as being a cog in the machine, and his Vegapunk entry states that he prefers to follow orders rather than issue them, which is very awkward for someone in one of the highest positions of leadership that one could have in this world. One of the best metaphors I've ever heard for Kizaru is a man stuck in middle management. Someone who has given decades and decades of his life to a company that has slowly sucked away any and all ambition, and has left him as a functional husk. Kizaru is a man with no dreams, and that's why he stands so powerfully as one of Luffy's greatest foes. Luffy, he's all about dreams, and Kizaru, he's like a dream black hole. One that lulls you into a false sense of security by showing you a shiny beacon of light to follow. However, he exists to end the dreams of others and substitute absolutely nothing in their place. Even Blackbeard, a man literally made of darkness who also literally may or may not be able to sleep, has more dreams than Kizaru. And as a result of this, Kizaru is one of the only extremely high-level figures in the series who does not have Conqueror's Haki for obvious reasons, which is both a monumental achievement, making it that far without such a key ability, but also a perfect metaphor for his existence. Kizaru puts in all of the work, but he's not building anything for himself. He has no will that he's exerting. Kizaru works just as hard as all of the greatest conquerors on this planet, but unlike them, he has nothing to show for it. However, Kizaru does greatly admire those who do have dreams and ideals. He may not necessarily understand why they fight and go to the extremes they do, but he does respect it. And a fantastic example of this is when Kizaru is ordered to infiltrate the lava phase by Saint Saturn. However, Kizaru refused to simply do that because it would ignore Sentomaru, a man who, in Kizaru's own words, was making a quote principled stand. So Kizaru took a detour to honor Sentomaru's beliefs before continuing his mission. And while it is rare, Kizaru has also formed some very real friendships. Other than a single image we have of Kizaru as a child, the oldest known sighting of this man was when he met Dr. Vegapunk, who would go on to become Kizaru's oldest and potentially even only friend. In fact, we have yet to meet another character who would dare designate themselves in Kizaru's social circle like that. The only other bond we've seen to this point is with Sakazuki, and that's more of a Yakuza colleague dynamic. They refer to each other as brothers, but it's a very formal brother. And Kizaru went on to play a major role in many of Vegapunk's projects, including the development of the pacifista laser tech, building Egghead Island himself, and he was even put in charge of supervising Vegapunk during Kuma's procedure, which gave us the one and only moment of genuine happiness we've ever seen from Kizaru, which is the now iconic pizza party, where even Kizaru is performing the Nika dance taught to him by Bartholomew Kuma, which is extremely ironic because this is a dance of hope for the future. It's performed by those who see a vision for the dawn of the world, which accurately defines every other character at this party, but not him. And perhaps in this very moment, Kizaru did have that vision. However, whatever hope and clarity was briefly present here was swiftly removed with the erasure of Bartholomew Kuma. And if anything, after this moment, Kizaru doubled down on his cog in the machine model. He'd experienced that sliver of hope, and he'd experienced how that hope was immediately erased. And he was left even more empty than before, because now he knows what he's missing. And this perspective of justice is on full display during the Paramount War. Kizaru was present for a tremendous amount of the Marineford arc, but despite that, there's not a whole lot to say about him or his actions. He does have a lot of fantastically hype action moments. He gets to kick a bird, and that's pretty cool. But this arc is all about Kizaru being the best cog he can. He doesn't express any desires or emotions during the long battle battle, and it actually shows us one of the greatest strengths of Unclear Justice. Because most of the fighters on this battlefield had an emotional attachment or conflict to deal with in some way, but Kizaru's Unclear Justice allowed him to just do his job and function as one of the most effective soldiers he could have been. There was no hesitation, only action. And in such a complicated mess of an event, I do find it interesting that the only character who had true clarity during the war was the man who practices deliberately unclear justice. There were over 100,000 Marines present at this conflict, and afterwards the vast majority had some sort of trauma or learning experience, but Kizaru came away from the most impactful pre-time skip event as if it was any other day at the office. So there's definite advantages to remaining as unfeeling as possible, and this is probably how Kizaru has risen so high within the Marines. He doesn't have the ambition to claim an admiral position, but he also isn't plagued by the same questions and hesitations of morality that every other recruit is. And in a time of crisis, that lack of hesitation can make all the difference. And it's at this point that I should also mention Kizaru's special appearances in the One Piece franchise. I affectionately refer to Kizaru as the movie Admiral because he takes a very active role in many of the modern One Piece films, and his abilities tend to get used to showcase animation. Kizaru's light powers are very aesthetically compelling to watch, so the films like to take full advantage of that. And Kizaru maintains his mystique throughout these films, as these appearances only add to his legend. Kizaru is the one who kills Zephyr at the end of Film Z. Kizaru leading a Buster Call was the event that caused everyone to flee Delta Island in One Piece Stampede. And in One Piece Film Red, it took Shanks, red-haired Shanks, Emperor of the Sea, just to quell the threat of Kizaru. Movie Kizaru definitely represents that legendary godlike Kizaru, and does not at all present him as the man he actually is. We'd need to wait until Egghead Island to really see that part of him on full display. Kizaru served as a secondary antagonist during the Egghead Island arc, where he is flung into an immediate rematch with Luffy, which starts with our rubber captain stating, compared to 2 years ago, we're 100 times stronger now, which is a reference to the Shaki power scaling of Ray Lee that we mentioned earlier. So now Luffy is declaring that he is ready to fight on Kizaru's previously unattainable level. And something that has to be taken into account in this specific situation is the real-world time gap between Sabaody and Egghead Island. Luffy first encountered Kizaru in chapter 511, which was published in August 2008, and Luffy would not be in a position to properly take on Kizaru until chapter 1091, published in September 2023. That's almost exactly 15 years, and that's why Luffy's dominance against Kizaru in this Egghead fight feels so earned. In most shonen series, you could have a character literally 100 times stronger than the protagonist rock up and have them defeated by the very next arc or even in the same arc, which often feels very cheap and unearned. But we watch Luffy struggle and develop over 15 years of real time to earn the power to fight on and even beyond Kizaru's level. And thematically, there's also an exploration of light happening here. Luffy, the sun god, fighting with his dawn attacks versus Kizaru fighting with his manufactured light attacks. And Luffy's light proves to be superior. And also the feeling of fighting and struggling against a god has been flipped. On Egghead Island, Luffy is the one who feels unstoppable. And because he can now transform into a giant, he also now outscales Kizaru physically. But it wasn't just Luffy either, because Kizaru was also dwarfed by the presence of Saint Saturn as well as the other Elder Stars eventually. And there came a point during Egghead Island where I'd forgotten that Kizaru was even in it, because we had moved so far beyond anything he could possibly deal with. He ended this arc feeling very mortal, very vulnerable. He ended this arc feeling the same way to me as the worst generation members felt against him on Sabaody. Especially because Kizaru's end here, it's less than spectacular. Kizaru gets squished into a pancake, spun like pizza dough, and tossed off the island like an empty bottle into the ocean. Not very environmentally conscious of Monkey D. Luffy, but I guess he had some shorter term worries at the time. It was such a brilliant flip of perspective, especially because Luffy using Gear 5th is always smiling, like how Kizaru was always smiling. So we got to see Luffy in Kizaru's playground, and now we are seeing Kizaru in Luffy's playground. However, the main meat for Kizaru on Egghead Island was the mission to kill his oldest friend, Dr. Vegapunk, and like Marineford, this is what Unclear Justice is designed to protect Kizaru from. Most people would need to take a bit of a moment before signing up to kill their best friend, not this man though, because Unclear Justice is designed to keep Kizaru from dwelling on those thoughts, and he does carry out his mission by being the person to deliver that killing blow to Vegapunk. However, what happens next is rather appropriately unclear. At the end of Egghead Island, Kizaru was left broken. He spent the entire climax of this arc on the floor of a battleship, and his final appearance during Egghead was bursting into tears thinking about what he just had to do. It would seem that Unclear Justice had failed him, but I would argue otherwise. otherwise. In this case, unclear justice actually led to the most just outcome. Kizaru killing his friend is what triggered Vegapunk's message to be played across the world, which has now changed the course of history for the better and will lead to the downfall of the world government. In a very convoluted and very unclear way, Kizaru did exactly what Vegapunk needed him to do, and acting as this perfect cog in the machine for once actually resulted in the just outcome. Now, as for where Kizaru goes from here, right now, I feel like the only way he could be further explored would be to give him a dream or inherited will as a result of this experience. Honestly though, I feel pretty satisfied with him. Not every antagonist needs that full circle redemption, and I think the ideas that Kizaru was designed to explore were implemented pretty much perfectly. I definitely wouldn't say no to more of him in the future, but I do also think this is a more than acceptable place for his character to just take a rest. Although there definitely will be more because we cannot ignore a Marine Admiral. So we'll see, but right now, I don't see any reason not to award Kizaru a coveted S tier. He's not your typical One Piece villain, and he didn't have the memorable struggles provided by a Lucia, Crocodile, or Adolfo Flamingo, but at the same time, he was far more impactful than any of them, and carried out his own multi-arc purpose flawlessly. He didn't tank his follow-up like Jack, he didn't vanish from the story like Magellan, and he wasn't as narratively risky as Hody Jones. Kizaru just got the job done to as high of a standard as he could, as always, and I don't think there's anything more that I could have asked for. But you let me know in the comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next. This is Caesar Clown, this is Gangsta Gastino, and this is Medicine Man Cedar. Three shockingly similar faces of evil that took us on a villainous journey through Punk Hazard, Dressrosa, Zoe, and Whole Cake Island. Quite the CV for a rather single and ready-to-mingle gas villain, but just how potent are his gases compared to that of the greatest antagonist in One Piece? Well, we're going to find out because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video. This time featuring the guy it is that everyone loves to hate, Caesar Clown. Caesar is of course the main antagonist of the Punk Hazard arc, and he has a much stronger introduction as a villain than I think many people tend to remember. Although this might be a bit of an indictment of what he goes on to be, but he was such an incredibly intimidating presence while he was being kept off screen. Because we spend a lot of time on Punk Hazard before properly meeting Caesar, however his presence can be felt at every stage as we get to know Caesar by seeing his work, such as the centaurs scattered throughout the island or the gigantification experiments on children. And with that latter one, even though we don't know properly what's happening at the time, this is a pretty disturbing and egregious offense for One Piece. Yes, One Piece villains do horrible things, but very rarely do they kidnap children, drug them with candies, and perform body horror-esque experiments on them. This is new and dark territory for us, especially since this dude who quite literally lures children with candy also knows that these kids have an expiry date due to all of the drugging it is that he's done. Under current circumstances, these kids have 5 years left to live at most, after which point Caesar says that he needs to find new test subjects. And this is just one of the many sickening passions that Caesar is pursuing. And we discover another when Nami and Chopper stumble upon what they describe as a frozen corpse room, which is one of the more horrific panels in One Piece because it very much reminds me of like a serial killer's den in a horror movie. And I really do think that horror movie is a good way to describe Caesar's introduction because everything we discover on Punk Hazard is deeply unsettling. And because we don't see who's behind it, it really stimulates the imagination in the worst way possible, conjuring an image and a feeling that, arguably Caesar wasn't capable of living up to. But this initial feeling is also enhanced by the fact that our first few visual glimpses of Caesar present him as this contorted column of gas, which is both impersonal and incredibly mysterious. It's like Oda is trying to do his very best to remove all humanity from Caesar and depict him as a more otherworldly demonic presence, which I really like. However, because this is One Piece, Oda does balance this out with some wacky comedy, because in typical Oda manner, he takes this opportunity to draw something just real weird, such as when Caesar is sipping a delightful drink in this gas form, which kind of kills the demonic vibes, but it does increase curiosity, because now there is a range of personality that we need to discover and figure out with this man. However, like most horror movies, the monster loses a lot of its power as soon soon as it's first fully seen, and Caesar is no exception to that, as his first full reveal presents as a character inspired by Cesar Romero's Joker in the 1960s Batman TV series. 60s Batman is one of the strangest things to have ever aired on TV, so it actually mixes quite well with One Piece, which is also one of the stranger pieces of media to have ever been created. And I can't imagine that this happens in the original Japanese, but in the official English translation, when Caesar sends the Yeti Cool brothers off to deal with the Straw Hats, he refers to them as his quote dynamic duo, which is what Batman and Robin are referred to. So we very quickly take Caesar in that much more camp direction, as over the course of Punk Hazard he's given these increasingly wacky faces and turns out to be a subversion of the maniacal science demon that his work presented him as. This is a pretty common switch up with One Piece villains. Oda likes to start serious and then flip the wacky switch, but I don't know if it works as well with Caesar as it has with other characters in the past. To illustrate, right before we see him in full for the first time, one final disturbing act we see is Caesar gassing one of his centaurs who's bleeding for his life, as Caesar is just laughing and telling him to rest in peace. It's a pretty disturbing scene. And we go from that immediately into this campy, jokey atmosphere with a pretty heavy hit of whiplash. And the rest of Punk Hazard is this constant back and forth between the worst person who has ever lived and this kind of funny slapstick comedian. It's like what would happen if Charlie Chaplin decided to be a vicious dictator, which to be fair, he does already have the moustache for. But what drives this clown man? Well, it's a complicated assortment of mental issues that have resulted in Caesar being a textbook narcissist. So much so that I bet you, sitting at home, could even open your copy of the DSM-5 and bam, there would be a picture of Caesar Clown right there. On every page, he has everything wrong with him. One of his most profound features is, of course, his arrogance, which is definitely not a bad thing for a One Piece antagonist to be. However, the best antagonists are always the ones that have the substance to back up that arrogance. Like Doflamingo, like Kaido, like Katakuri. And while Caesar isn't a complete Spandam Archie level dud in terms of personal substance, he still doesn't have what it takes to back up his own impression of himself. Caesar claims to be a lot of things, one of which is the most deadly man alive. And so he's trying to construct a weapon designed to efficiently kill as many people as possible. To quote Caesar, "The biggest problem with my last test was that those who were poisoned could still evacuate in a weakened state. So instead, for the next iteration of this weapon, he concocted a paralyzing agent. So once caught by the poison, people would be frozen in place and forced to ingest a lethal amount of poison. He went on to call this ultimate weapon Land of the Dead, and Caesar implemented it because he wanted to see, and I quote, hell on earth," which is a pretty extreme desire. And one that I think spawns from the beauty that Caesar sees in these weapons. It's not just about killing for the sake of killing, although it does often feel like that, but there is a deeper scientific appreciation and marvel of every new development that Caesar makes. However, I do think that this aspect of Caesar is severely undercooked, which is why he comes off as a bit flat. But another title that Caesar grants himself is the greatest genius to have ever lived. And I've said this with a couple of other villains in the series before, but there is something extremely dangerous about a person of above average intelligence who thinks they're a genius, because a true genius like Dr. Vegapunk is smart enough to know exactly how much there is out there that he does not know. But Caesar can't see that. He only knows what he knows, and because he knows that and can't know that he doesn't know anything else, he thinks he knows everything. And in fact, Caesar has claimed on multiple occasions that Dr. Vegapunk is jealous of his brilliance. So Caesar is trying to prove that brilliance to the world, and it isn't going very well, because just lying and lying over again won't change reality for you, even fictional reality. I will say I personally struggle a bit with Punk Hazard era Caesar, because he does often come off as evil for the sake of evil. Again, I don't think a lot of his deeper ideas were left in the oven long enough, and so there's not a huge amount of depth to what he's doing, and he's not trying particularly hard to do it either, because it's later revealed that he's been squandering colossal amounts of research funds to spend most of his time with, how shall we say, purchasable women. So I don't really buy that he's obsessed with pursuing the beauty of his science, nor do I buy that he's driven to prove his genius, because he casts both of these ambitions aside so flippantly. So there's not like a huge amount of solid substance to him, which may be appropriate given that he is a gas man. But in the interest of fairness in terms of villainy, Caesar also has his fair share of brilliantly sinister moments. In particular, there's a few close-ups of spine-tingling evil, like when he reveals that he was the one responsible for destroying Punk Hazard 4 years ago. Although these are definitely a lot rarer than the seemingly seemingly endless amounts of wacky face panels. But every now and then there is a glimpse of that little something, a something that I wish we got to see a lot more with Caesar. Something which is often present in flashbacks of Caesar because he masquerades as a caring person who only wants to help, and that's how he's able to generate such loyalty from those around him like Brownbeard, which makes it so heart-wrenching when that loyalty is unceremoniously betrayed by Caesar. That right there is a big plus point for a villain. What he did to Brownbeard, but I wish we'd gotten to see more of that manipulative Caesar. There's also some intimidating moments here and there, like when he's looking at Frankie's wanted poster and thinking about how he'll dismember Frankie's body, take the worthwhile parts, and then orders his lackey to preheat the incinerator for the rest of Frankie's unwanted remains. So he's extremely capable of being a commanding antagonist here and there. There are some times when he's on page and he just grabs you by the story nuts. But to continue being fair to this fictional science clown, I do think that a lot of Punk Hazard was very much outside of his command. Caesar is very much a victim of stolen thunder, as the moment, and I mean the moment, that Trafalgar Law is reintroduced on the island, it's like, Caesar who? Caesar who cares, that's who. Because in the snap of a finger, Law becomes the main point of intrigue of the arc. And he goes on to become a protagonist, but Caesar also has his antagonist role usurped from him, which happens the moment, and I mean the moment, that Virgo enters the picture, who is objectively cooler, much more proficient in every way, and has an extremely easy motive to get on board with, which results in Law versus Virgo being a much more climactic and compelling fight, in my opinion, than Luffy versus Caesar. That's why Punk Hazard is a bit of a weird arc, because it's not just Caesar. Arguably, Luffy takes a backseat as the main character as well. It's not just Caesar as the main antagonist who gets usurped. Trafalgar Law is very much the central driving force of events on this island. He's the man with the plan at all stages, and sometimes Luffy feels more like Law's second in command carrying out the order to capture Caesar. In fact, let me give you Luffy's exact wording for his motivation to fight Caesar. Caesar asks what reason Luffy has for coming after him, and Luffy replies, "I don't know yet, but if I capture you, something neat is supposed to happen." Which on the one hand I love because it's just classic Luffy. It's simple, it's charming, it's funny, it's fantastic for him, but it is horrible for Caesar's presence as an antagonist, because it's such a far cry from defeating Crocodile to save Alabasta, or beating Rob Lucci to rescue Robin, or even Enel, who Luffy fought for the sake of ringing the golden bell for Mont Blanc cricket. Every major antagonistic fight in One Piece has stakes for Luffy, except for this one, where he's just doing it because Law asked him nicely and maybe something cool will happen. And I would even argue that the Long Ring Longland fight against Foxy has higher stakes than against Caesar, because during Long Ring Longland, there were crewmates at stake during the Davy Back fight. And due to this, I do think that a lot of the Luffy Caesar scenes feel a bit empty compared to most Luffy fights. Not the whole thing though, definitely not the whole thing. Luffy does eventually kick into a much more serious gear after Momonosuke tells Luffy what Caesar plans on doing with the children, but this comes so late into the game. And in its defense, it does give us some very, very seriously satisfying punches, but by that point, I can't help but feel that we've already mentally moved so far away from Caesar, because Caesar's presence is minimized pretty much from the get-go. As soon as Law reveals that capturing Caesar is just part of a tiny plan to defeat Kaido. So we've always got that looming in the background. And so what we're doing on Punk Hazard all of a sudden doesn't feel particularly important. Furthermore, Doflamingo is consistently mentioned as the next immediate problem, and the moment, and I mean the moment, that Doflamingo was name dropped, Caesar became woefully inadequate. Because Caesar hadn't even been beaten yet, and we are already focusing on our next antagonist. Plus, as mentioned before, even Virgo very much took that role from Caesar on Punk Hazard itself. So Caesar's authority as a primary antagonist is undermined in his own arc by no less than 3 other characters, 2 of which aren't even present, and 1 of which we hadn't even seen at the time. It's a pretty rough deal for him, and I also don't think this was helped by the fact that he's a Logia user. Logia arc antagonists at the time came with some pretty high expectations set by Crocodile on Alabasta, Enel on Skypiea, Kizaru on Sabaody, and Sakazuki at Marineford. And even though Caesar did use his power to get the best of Luffy in their first encounter by taking away all of that sweet, sweet oxygens, which full credit to him, not all villains get to that stage with Luffy, but by Logia antagonist standards, Caesar fell so dramatically short of what we'd come to expect. And as a whole, I do believe that Caesar has part of the Spandam problem happening, which is that during any Slobby, Oda made Spandam both the most hated person on the planet and the comic relief at the same time, and it got very whiplashy, cutting from him doing stuff like beating Robin to then performing skit comedy. And I view Caesar in the same way. Oda is trying to cram these 2 opposing elements inside of him, and it's not that despicable characters can't be funny, they can be hilarious, and it's not that funny characters can't do horrible things, because sometimes they can be horrible. It's just that with Caesar and Spandam, they both inhabit the very extremes of those elements, and they don't always mesh well together. Something I vividly recall about Punk Hazard is this horrifying panel of Mocka having eaten a candy which causes her to fall to the floor, cough up blood, and convulse in what looks like some of the hardest hitting pain in the series. And just as a refresher, Mocka is only 9 years old, and these are the experiments that Caesar is carrying out on her and the rest of the children. So it becomes very difficult to laugh at the child torturer. It won't always be hard to laugh at him, certainly not, but it takes a lot of time to forget who he was on this island. And the process that happens across Dressrosa and Zoe is what I would describe as penance, where Caesar becomes a literal punching bag for the next few years as he is tied up, threatened, and consistently mentally and physically abused by our protagonists. All of which is wonderfully deserved and hilarious. The crew abuse his powers to turn him into a non-consensual hot air balloon on 2 occasions. Sanji uses Caesar as his chair in order to make a phone call. Chopper uses him as a net to catch cannonballs. And Sanji even threatened to, quote, blow Caesar's head clean off. The Straw Hats settle into this cycle of beating Caesar up, and then Chopper heals him so that they can beat him up more. His time with the crew is very much a form of purgatory. And it's through all of this hilarious purgatory that Caesar is rehabilitated as a character. It's a very gradual process, but eventually he becomes palatable to the readers and watchers, because we like seeing him pay for his crimes. We like seeing him being beaten up, which happens every time we see him, which means that that sentence can just be shortened to, we like seeing Caesar. And on Zoe, he even gets a moment of redemption when Caesar is forced to remove the Roko gas that Jack used to attack the Mink tribe, although it turns out that the Roko gas was a weapon developed by Caesar to begin with, but this is played as a joke. What was once Caesar's most sickening trait is now a gag. And on top of that, he often gets drawn in with group shots, almost giving the impression that he's part of the crew, which really he kind of is for quite some time. It took a good long while before Caesar left Straw Hat custody, and at the beginning of many volumes, Caesar is featured directly after Trafalgar Law, Kinemon, and Momonosuke, smack bang in our close ally cohort. And by the time Whole Cake Island rolls around, Caesar is fully transformed, with the final thing winning us over being Caesar's conflict with Big Mom. Because this is where Caesar ceases to be our enemy, because now he's the enemy of our enemy and therefore not quite as much of an enemy as before. And now what we're doing, right, is we're joining forces to bring down an Emperor of the Sea, and we're all dressing up to do it. And mate, how can you not love Gangster Gastino or Cedar the Medicine Man on Zoe? His comedy just continues to build and build. And he even gets a second moment of redemption by being the one responsible for saving everyone during the Tea Party escape. And it's at the stage now where, in current events, Caesar and Vince Smoke Judge have been reunited to former members of MADS, and also two of the objectively worst people we've ever met in this series, and yet I am genuinely excited to see what they do next. Caesar Clown has undergone such a long and what I would have thought to be impossible journey to occupy the space in my mind that he does today, which is a phenomenal achievement by Oda, but that doesn't answer the ultimate purpose of our video. As much as I enjoy him post-Punk Hazard, what we're here to judge is how effective he was at being a major antagonist. And the unfortunate answer to that is not very. He had a strong introduction and he was an incredibly commanding presence up until he showed himself, after which point he was pushed out of the spotlight by Law, Virgo, Doflamingo, and even the idea of Kaido, which turned Caesar's whole story into a bit of a side plot during the arc that he was meant to be commanding. And yes, Caesar does have a couple of fantastic moments here and there, but overall I do believe that he is our second E-tier antagonist alongside Walpole, which does make sense because Walpole and Caesar both occupy the same space in my head of the reformed scumbags who now just exist to make me laugh. But you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next. This is Foxy. He's challenging you to a Davy Back fight, which you should not accept because you, sir or madam, are going to lose. Because Foxy is not to be taken lightly. But just how heavy do the scales of villainy register this portly gent? Well, we're going to find out because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the stupid fox with its head split in two who looks like a real moron, Foxy. Alright, let's start this by saying that this video is going to be be a little bit different from the standard villain ones, because Foxy simply cannot be held to the criteria of what we'll call a serious One Piece villain, because Foxy to date is the only major arc antagonist who has been designed and implemented as a pure joke. However, there is a lot more to him than that, and he does serve a purpose that you'll only discover when rereading the Long Ring Long Land arc. So firstly, Foxy's introduction is quite ominous, because he's another one of those villains who we're introduced to through their work before we physically meet him. And in this case, after dropping down from Skypiea, the Straw Hats encounter a pirate ship that is almost completely devoid of its crew. And the few crew members who are left aboard don't have the skills to sail the Grand Line, nor do they have the patience to try and work together to salvage this situation. They are a crew who have completely fallen apart. And then they proceed to get swallowed by the dangers of the Grand Line. In this case, a big wave conjured by sneaky sea monkeys. But this scene is far more powerful in retrospect than it is when you read it for the first time. Because when it comes down to it, the purpose of Foxy and the Davy Back fight, and I guess this whole arc in general, is to seed the idea of losing crew members in a fun, lighthearted way before it happens for real, and sends us into a deep despair for the rest of the saga. But for these guys who we encounter before reaching Long Ring Long Land, that despair has already happened. And they're falling apart in the same way that we would see the Straw Hats go on to fall apart at Water 7. After Robin disappears and Usopp leaves the crew, the Straw Hats barely hold themselves together. And there is a point where it looks like the entire crew may just dissolve right then and there, and ultimately lose to the challenges of the Grand Line. They don't. Our crew are a better crew and are able to overcome said challenges, but Foxy does a very good job of introducing us to this idea. And his overall role in this saga is to serve as a farcical representation of what's to come. But Foxy's actual introduction is a lot less funny than many of you may have experienced, because there is a night and day difference between anime Foxy and manga Foxy. Long Ring Long Land as a whole is a completely different experience between those two mediums, and we'll be getting into a bit more of that as we go. For now, the important thing is that anime watchers may remember that Foxy was introduced shooting a net at Shelly, Tonjit's horse. However, in the manga, this is a lot more brutal, as Foxy straight up shoots Shelly with a gun, and she falls, there's blood and everything, and it's just generally not a good time. Which is a very strong introduction for manga Foxy, because it does show you that behind all of that, there is something to be taken seriously. Yeah, most of this arc is pure comedy, but there is still something there to be feared with Foxy. And if you let him have his way, he will completely ruin your life. And that's a pretty stark contrast to anime Foxy, who right off the bat is portrayed as a complete non-entity through the censorship of shooting Shelly. Capturing her in a net, which is a very almost 4Kids maneuver, makes Foxy seem a lot more like a Wile E. Coyote kind of character than someone that you should, in any way take seriously. And to be fair, I do think that tone does work, well enough for the Long Ring Long Land arc. You can get away with it, but you lose that extra bit of dimension with Foxy. In the manga, Foxy is a very disarming presence. He spends so much time being a punchline, but every now and then he will do something as a reminder that, hey, we could actually be in trouble here. And one of those serious moments is Foxy's win-loss ratio. Before encountering Luffy, Foxy and his crew have had 920 Davy Back fight wins and checks notes 0 losses. Those are not amazing odds for anyone going up against him, and remember that the Foxy Pirates, they are a Grand Line crew. They're not East Blue scrubs. They're not something that you accidentally step in on the way to the Grand Line like this Don Creek. Get that off my shoe. There's a reason why this crew have made it this far, and it is due to the art of deception. Foxy is a caricature of the foxes of Japanese folklore, often renowned for their cleversome deception, and part of this deception is in his first proper introduction, where his bounty is revealed to be a mere 24 million berries. And this is nothing. It's actually lower than Luffy's initial East Blue bounty, let alone the 100 million berries that he's worth at this point. But all of this is part of Oda deceiving us into taking Foxy lightly. He's not just deceiving the Straw Hats, he's deceiving the readers, the yous. And that's what makes it incredibly powerful when Foxy's crew does win the first game and takes Chopper from the crew. And I also need to note another thing. When Luffy accepts the Davy Back fight, the first reaction we see is from Usopp, and this is not an accident. Usopp immediately understands the seriousness of what Luffy has agreed to, and he is furious at Luffy for taking this risk, to which Luffy just replies, as long as we don't lose, we'll be fine. Again, this is all quite funny when reading it through for the first time, but in retrospect, this is a bit of a moment for Usopp, because he's seeing how reckless Luffy is willing to act with crew members. And that's part of what contributes to the argument between Luffy and Usopp on Water 7, because by that point, Usopp knows how readily, illogically, and again recklessly, Luffy is willing to risk his crew, or at least least that's what it looks like to Usopp. And not only that, Luffy will do it without the input from his crew. So when Usopp is arguing about Mary, who he considers to be a crew member, it's calling back to Luffy's refusal to listen to him about the Davy Back fight on Long Ring Longland. Usopp doesn't feel heard by Luffy. And I know that that's been a completely Foxy-less tangent in this very Foxy-focused video, but that is a very important aspect of Foxy that a lot of people understandably miss. His role in this arc isn't about taking the spotlight for himself. In fact, a great recurring gag is the Straw Hats consistently outshining him and winning the vocal support of Foxy's crew. But it's not about Foxy, it's about the chaos that he introduces into the crew dynamic. Long Ring Longland is an arc focused on the Straw Hats. We see in a comical setting how they work together, where their failings are, how vulnerable the crew truly is, and how those vulnerabilities could and would go on to be taken advantage of by figures much more sinister than Foxy. What Foxy does is highlight the flaws of the crew that are going to be exploited and need to be overcome. Because at this point, as infamous as they are still a baby rookie pirate crew, and they need to mature to survive going forward. However, Foxy's greatest strength as an individual character is without question comedy. To date, I think that Foxy is the funniest character that Oda has ever written and probably ever will write, and you can tell that Oda had the time of his life because of how expressive Foxy's face is. It's almost like Oda set himself a challenge to see how many different creative ways that he could use the most ridiculous face in the world while he had the chance. Because every time Foxy appears in a new panel is an opportunity for a new gag, and Oda takes the vast majority of those opportunities. One of my personal favorite Foxy gags is when Foxy is trying to distract Nami's team during the donut race, when he is very poorly pretending to be a dying old lady pleading for help, and Nami immediately sees through this, but the commentator brands her as absolutely heartless for ignoring the pleas of this dying old woman. And for the rest of the Davy Back fight, Nami then has this reputation of being a horrible person for not falling for Foxy's trick. So that's the thing about Foxy's gags, it's compound comedy. It's very rarely a one-off laugh. It's something that has an impact and then goes on to create knock-on laughs, like this situation with Nami. However, my second favorite Foxy gag is when he and Luffy are spinning the cannon randomly to choose the venue for the combat round, and it comes to a snap abrupt stop pointing at Foxy's obviously rigged ship. It is such a simple gag, but it gets me every time. Just the blatant cheating on display, and Itomitsu the commentator taking it so seriously, saying, oh, by pure chance the cannon just so happens to have landed on the ship of the sexy Foxy. Although my all-time favorite Foxy gag is when Luffy is running through the ship and comes across both the nurse and the chef, who are so obviously Foxy, and this sort of thing would never work in any other context, but Luffy is such a believably gullible protagonist that it all comes together perfectly. And that's an underrated reason why Foxy works so well. It's about his dynamic with Luffy. Quite possibly the only person on this planet who can play the straight man in Foxy's skits. But the whole combat round on the ship is a magnificent display of wacky creativity, and look, if Foxy spent half as much time training as he did coming up with these gadgets to trick people, then mark my words, he would be an emperor of the sea right now. And I mean that because something we have yet to speak about is Foxy's absolutely ridiculous devil fruit. This is the slow fruit that creates Norma photons, which slow down anything they come into contact with by 30 seconds, which in the hands of an emperor, an admiral, or perhaps even a warlord would make them practically undefeatable. Because even in the Davy Back fight against Foxy, there is a palpable element of danger for Luffy, because the simple threat of the slow beam meant that Luffy couldn't stretch for the vast majority of this fight. Think about that. Luffy couldn't use any of his techniques on Foxy because of that damn fictional fruit. And now think about what that would be like against an actually powerful opponent. Because I don't think you understand just how long 30 seconds is until you or part of you is forced to stand still for 30 seconds in the presence of someone like Kaido. But in Foxy's case, his devil fruit is extremely important because it's a genuinely fascinating ability with a surprising range of applications. And it is always fascinating to see what kind of weird idea Foxy comes up with next, at least in the manga. In the anime, he gets a bit boring because they have him doing the same things over and over again. The same use of his fruit, the same gags about his self-esteem, the same dress-ups. Because the anime writers, they just do not have the creative spark that Oda has to handle a character like this. But to keep giving Foxy credit, he does even have a handful of pretty epic moments, like when he and Luffy are being introduced for the combat round with their bounties being projected in the sky. This is such an awesome visual, and it makes me want to see a modern-day Davy Back fight where we have a matchup of stupidly powerful figures like, say, Luffy versus Shanks, or even Luffy versus Buggy. But even with Luffy versus Foxy, this gets me pumped for this complete joke of a fight to come. And I think that's a very special skill to be able to generate that much hype for a comedy fight. And a lot of the credit with stuff like this also needs to go to the Foxy Pirates as a whole, who are such a fun crew and always doing amazing things like the cheerleader spelling out Foxy's name, or Foxy's dancing hype men in the background of the combat round, who may or may not be actual foxes. There's no other point in One Piece where we've just been allowed to have unrestricted fun like this. Even Luffy using Gear 5th is not as fun as what happened on Long Ring Longland, and that is all thanks to Foxy. And furthermore, he has an incredibly satisfying defeat. I always love seeing Foxy brought down by his own ability, and all it took was one serious punch from Luffy to bring Foxy down for good. Because when you break through the facade, disarm all the traps, air out all the illusions, and just get down to punch fighting, Foxy crumbles magnificently. And because of his devil fruit, we get a full 30 seconds to spend basking in Foxy's imminent defeat. And I love seeing his face gradually contorting because of the punch, and everyone in the crowd counting down until the effect wears off. I mean, just mate, for a joke fight, it has an incredible ending. But look, Foxy does his job so well because he is meant to be a hilarious representation of what the world government would go on to do. During Long Ring Longland, Foxy stole a crew member from the Straw Hats, and the crew had to come together to take him back. And in the case of the world government, they stole a crew member on Water 7, and the Straw Hats had to come together to take her back. Just as Luffy shot down the world government flag at any slobby, on Long Ring Longland, he decided to claim Foxy's flag and even give him a brand new one. But my absolute favorite piece of Foxy foreshadowing is his fight with Luffy, because there is this phenomenal panel of Luffy dramatically getting up behind Foxy after receiving a pretty serious beating, and this panel is directly referenced again at the end of any slobby, with Luffy dramatically getting up behind Rob Lucci before delivering his final attack. Because the most dramatic part of Long Ring Longland is when Luffy declares that even if it kills him, he won't lose a single member of his crew. And during any slobby, Luffy proves that and wraps up the plotline that Foxy and Long Ring Longland started. That's why I do get a bit annoyed when people recommend skipping Long Ring Longland. A lot of people do just see it as meaningless filler, but whether you're aware of it or not, it does set up all of these extremely powerful moments down the line. However, that also brings us to the topic of anime versus manga, because in the anime there is a much stronger argument to skipping this arc, even though I still probably wouldn't recommend it. But Long Ring Longland is Toei's greatest crime against One Piece, in my opinion, because it signaled the beginning of the era where filler really ramped up. And so in the quest for filler, Long Ring Longland became 2 Davy Back fights instead of 1. The games were split up differently, different people participate in games that they weren't in the manga. The rules become unnecessarily confusing because the game doesn't make sense anymore in order to insert filler, and the whole arc is mangled to the point where it's almost completely unrecognizable from the manga. But the impact that this has on Foxy, which is what we actually care about for the purpose of this video, is not good. Foxy is a presence for exactly 14 chapters in the manga, and with decent pacing that should translate into 4 to 5 anime episodes. However, this is extended into a wild 17 anime episodes, as Toei adds in a second Davy Back fight, as well as an additional 4-episode sequel arc called Foxy's Return, which involves a third Davy Back fight. 17 episodes, that's almost a whole season of traditional anime. And that is far too many episodes to be carried on Foxy's shoulders. The main issue is that, as stated before, the anime writers were just not skilled enough story chefs to serve up an acquired taste like Foxy, and as a result, Foxy gets real annoying real quickly because he lacks that flair that he has with Oda's writing. He's just a series of the same 2 to 3 repeating gags. None of the new material gives him something of substance to add, and if we're talking about anime Foxy, then look, we'd have to create a whole new category on this tier list below the worst possible option to slot him into. But luckily for Foxy, we're not. I don't think it's fair to punish him for the mistakes of the anime, who do continue to shove Foxy in wherever they can, because he was also in the Spa Island filler, he was in the Boss Luffy specials, and the Adventure of Nebulandia. There's so much Foxy in the anime. But in the manga, he's only appeared one other time, which was extremely recently in chapter 1115, having apparently gone on a losing streak over the past 2 years, and now his once 500-man crew consists only of Porsche, Hamburg, and Foxy himself, which is a very fun check-in. I love Foxy, but we don't need much more of him than that. And it was an almost 20-year gap between appearances in the manga. And he did also have the briefest of cameos in the One Piece live-action series where we see his bounty, and that is plenty of Foxy. I highly doubt that he'll be in the show in any real capacity if they do make it that far, so this is a very nice short, sharp, and sweet reference. And so that brings us to placement. Foxy is another difficult character character to rank within this framework because as a villain, I have to admit he does his job perfectly. He sets up the next saga, he plants the seeds of crew conflict, he tells some fun jokes, gets smacked in the face, and then takes a 20-year absence from the story to recover. So he gets full points on his villain exam. It's just that his exam is not the same exam that's issued to most other villains. If Crocodile's exam was a university level paper, then Foxy's is more like a primary school exam. Because most One Piece villains come with different expectations. There is a lot more that is asked of them, and even if Foxy did perfectly nail what little was asked of him, it just still wouldn't feel right to give him an S tier alongside villains who were asked to do infinitely more and succeeded. So with that said, we are going to give Foxy a solid perfect C tier. Wonderfully serviceable, enjoyable, and functional, but not a character who ever had the opportunity to do more. And you let me know in the comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next. This is Saint J. Garcia Saturn, warrior god of science and defense. Also known as a disease maker, god faker, lots of paper, slave labor, Emmet Waker, Kizaru shaker, Kuma breaker, and of course, gourmet sausage appreciator. Saint J. Garcia Saturn certainly is a lot of things, but is he a good, bad villain man? Well, it's our job to find out because we are of course on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the all of the things that is that I just said, Saint J. Garcia Saturn. So in Australia, we have a rather special saying that I think applies to this video. That saying is, we're not here to spiders, and that roughly translates to, gentlemen, we should probably commence business. And the first piece of said business that we need to talk about with Saturn is the Great Wait, which insert your own fat pun here due to Saturn's rotund nature, but what I'm referring to is the real world time between Saturn's first appearance and when he actually did something. The time period between those 2 points is the Great Wait, which began on June 10th, 2002 with chapter 233, where we were introduced to Saint Saturn and the rest of the old men that compose the 5 Elder Stars, and the Great Wait ended on the 30th of January 2023 with chapter 1073, which ended with the reveal of Saint Saturn's name and showing us that he was on his way to Egghead Island. So that is 850 chapters, also known as just over 21 years. Not many series have the luxury of a character just sitting there and waiting for that long, and to be clear, Saint Saturn did very little other than sit in his special chair in the room of authority at the Holy Land of Marineford. So as an antagonist, Saturn stepped into an active role with unparalleled expectations. And the question we need to answer is, was Saturn's role worth waiting 21 years for? The short answer is, yeah, probably. But the long answer is the rest of this video. And in this case, we need to start smack bang with this unfathomably old man's face, because on rare occasions in One Piece, author Eiichiro Oda bases his characters on real life figures. The best known example of this is that every Marine Admiral is essentially a caricature of famous Japanese actors, which gives them all an enhanced sense of tangibility because they are one stop closer to reality than the rest of the One Piece world. Sometimes it's almost as if they could leap straight off the pages and into reality. And at times this produces a very uncanny and uneasy feeling, which works really well for the Admirals because as the 3 biggest power dudes in the Navy, and we, protagonists being pirates, we are supposed to be uneasy around them to say the very least. And Oda went on to apply this same idea to the 5 Elder Stars, who were all based on real-life figures of some political prominence. And for quite some time, it was heavily speculated that Saint Saturn was based on Karl Marx, a German philosopher, economist, historian, etc. According to his Wikipedia article, he did apparently literally everything that could have been done at the time. And Saturn does bear some resemblance to Marx with the bushy facial hair. However, Saturn's inspiration actually comes from Giuseppe Garibaldi, a key figure in the unification of Italy, considered to be one of the fathers of the fatherland. And not only does Saturn take on Giuseppe's appearance, but Saint Saturn is almost always depicted posing with his walking stick in the exact same manner as Giuseppe in this famous photograph. And I should also say that his name, J. Garcia, may also be inspired by guitarist Jerry Garcia, who also has a rather bushy Saturn-esque beard, but that connection is much harder to prove. But there is a certain degree of weight attached to Saint Saturn, because whether you're consciously aware of it or not, Saturn carries that history and legacy with him, which gives him a lot more presence than most Oda characters who he he has to build up from absolute zero. And there is a great sense of unease whenever Saturn and the other elders are on page or on screen, because it's like staring at a living slice of history that, just doesn't quite belong there. Which is, of course, very intentional on Oda's part, because we do go on to see a panel of Saint Saturn from 200 years ago, and he looks exactly the same, as if he's been frozen in time. I mean, I say as if, that's almost certainly what happened. Saturn was a man who was granted a degree of immortality by Emu, and choosing to base him so heavily on a real-world historical figure is the perfect choice to portray this man frozen in time. Saturn's also in a very unique position in media, because the weight of his immortality can be deeply felt, and not just by his design, but by the sheer amount of time that readers and watchers have spent waiting for him. Longtime readers have been seeing this man for the last 20-something years, and nothing about him has changed. His looks and his actions have been almost completely stagnant, and the fact that we didn't even know his name for 2 decades built Saturn up as this timeless entity. Because I don't know about you, but I've aged 20 years since I first saw Saint Saturn. But he hasn't. He hasn't aged at all. And had things not played out the way that they did, I think there's every chance that Saint Saturn would have outlived me, because I am a mere mortal man on the internet. So if there was anyone in this world worthy of holding the title of a god, which Saturn did claim to be, then look, he is the closest we've come so far. But let's talk about the concept of evil, because most One Piece antagonists, they fall into this fun spectrum of good and evil. You've got your atrocious scumbags at one end, like Caesar Clown and Spandam, and then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got antagonists who were the heroes of their own stories, like Charlotte Katakuri. But most other antagonists fall somewhere gracefully in the middle, very rarely being classified as either simple black or white. But the revolutionary thing that Saint Saturn did was completely redefine our One Piece spectrum and show us for the first time the true depth of pure black that Eiichiro Oda can create. Saturn may look like a feeble old man, but watch carefully as he clumsily collides with this here wall, silly Saint Saturn. You should really watch where you're going, and look, you've dropped your pentagram? That is how the truth of Saint Saturn was introduced to us. Via a magical pentagram appearing out of nowhere on Egghead Island, emanating dark, sinister aura, fire, smoke, and a shadowy monster being conjured in the center. And it's pretty difficult to depict one as more blatantly evil than that, especially in a series that doesn't particularly subscribe to magic and demons. Although this sort of idea isn't completely foreign to One Piece, previously we had seen a society of, quote, black magic users, or at least people who claimed to use it and accidentally ended up believing themselves, because coincidentally Brook landed in the center of their summoning circle at just the right time. The difference is that was clearly played for comedy and panties, because even the cultists on Namakura Island were shocked that their ritual worked and they successfully summoned the devil. But in the case of Saturn, there's no room for any other interpretation, because what we see is a true devil rising from dark sorcery, which may or may not be devil fruit related. We don't know that for a fact at the time of this recording, but it probably is, and even if it is still a living demon right in front of our eyes. And quite specifically, Saturn's transformed state takes the form of a yokai named Gyuki, or alternatively known as an Ushioni, a cursed creature with the body of a spider and the head of an ox, often depicted with the face of a demon stuck in middle management, completely exhausted and honestly just a little bit over existence as a concept, which is a comical thing to say, but here's what makes Saturn evil. What really hammers home how evil Saturn is that he has no comical character traits. Oda has left no room for him to be likable by the readers in the same way that he gives Caesar Clown fun and wacky moments despite all of the real dark stuff he did. And even St. Charles, one of the most horrible creatures to have ever been spawned from the putrid swamp between his mother's legs, is usually a hilarious character. I love seeing St. Charles because it means that he's about to get hit. I like seeing that, which means I like seeing Charles. But Saturn is a different beast altogether. There isn't a single redemptive quality granted to this man, and even the online fanbase has struggled to meme on him in the same way as every other character. Yes, there were a couple of good ones like Sailor Saturn, and Saturn recreating Luffy's I Still Have My Friend's 2-page spread from pre-time skip, but overall, he is a powerfully disliked individual. And as he should be, because look, here's what Saturn thinks of you. Think of human lives as nothing more than insects. They will always breed more to make up for any loss. So Saturn almost always refers to humans as insects. And to him, there's no discrimination beyond that. Saturn even views his own forces within the Marines with the same disdain as his enemies. To him, humanity is a plague to be dealt with, and mentally, even though he's probably biologically no different, Saturn has completely separated himself from the human species. Or perhaps separated the human species from him. Or potentially even both. He's not a human, he's put himself above those, and humans, they're not humans, he's put them below that. They're insects. What he's done is he's constructed the largest gap possible between him and all of the lower folk. And no singular individual has been more harmed by this particular devil than Bartholomew Kuma. If Saint Saturn can be described as 100% pure concentrated evil, then Bartholomew Kuma is his polar opposite, a being of 100% pure good to a degree that no genuine saint in this world could ever be capable of matching. And this right here, this bear man, is the true meat of Saturn as an antagonist. What makes Saturn such a uniquely detestable villain is how he systematically targets and dismantles Bartholomew Kuma across his entire life. As a child, Kuma first encountered Saturn during the God Valley incident, where Saturn claimed that Kuma was born into a slave caste and stated that your only options are slavery and death. History itself chose them for you. And whilst Kuma did end up escaping God Valley, matey, you can't outrun the devil, and Saturn would do everything, and I mean everything in his power, to make good on those words, which included abducting and experimenting on Ginny, the love of Kuma's life. Saturn infected her with a rare disease known as sapphire scales. And just as a side note, sapphire is the associated gemstone of the planet Saturn, so it's implied that Saturn, he wasn't just experimenting with this disease. It's actually more likely that he was the one who created the disease in the first place, which is very much in line with his yokai origins, as the Ushioni is said to cause an incurable disease to anyone unfortunate enough to come across it. And only when Ginny was on the verge of death via sapphire scales with no chance of recovery did Saturn, quote, dump her off so that Kuma could witness Saturn's work and ideally succumb to raw despair, which may very well have happened were it not for Ginny's newborn daughter, Jewelry Bonnie. Bonnie then became Kuma's reason to live. However, this was just another cruel twist in Saturn's plan, because Bonnie had been born with sapphire scales as well, and her life expectancy didn't extend into double digits, thus forcing Kuma to suffer through losing his most loved person in the world for a second time. That was one option anyway, but the one that Saint Saturn wanted and ultimately received was infinitely more cruel. In his desperation, Kuma brought Bonnie to Dr. Vegapunk for him to cure the condition, after which point Saturn stepped in and said that yes, he would allow it, but only under 3 conditions. 1, that Kuma would become a subservient warlord of the sea. 2, that his body would become an experimental weapon for the world government. And finally, that Kuma must abandon both his mind and his free will, effectively making good on his words decades before on God Valley. Your only options are slavery and death. And for the sake of Bonnie, Kuma chose slavery. Kuma's body was gutted and augmented. It became a cyborg. His memories were erased and he became a loyal robotic slave of the world government. And the Kuma-Saturn dynamic is a metaphor for the world government's effect on the world as a whole. What Saturn did to Kuma is exactly what the world government has been doing to the entire planet. And as vile as it is, that is exactly what elevates Saturn as a villain. I've never seen a character in One Piece both capable of such horrendous cruelty and someone who actually succeeded in implementing it. J. Garcia Saturn wasn't a being to be feared because of his raw power. He was to be feared because of his cold, calculating mind, seemingly incapable of being countered because no one else can access the depth of mental horror that Saturn casually conjures. But more importantly, Saint Saturn is to be feared because of his patience, something that the vast majority of One Piece antagonists lack, but all of the best ones use to their advantage. It's like a secret power. After Kuma escaped God Valley, Saturn didn't throw a tantrum and make any hasty moves. No, mate. Instead, what he did was this old man, he sat down, had a nice cup of tea, and carefully constructed a lifetime of torture for Kuma and implemented it very patiently, step by step, until Saturn achieved his twisted goal. At the moment, I think Saturn's only competition for patience is Blackbeard. He's the only other character who has shown this willingness to look decades into the future, and that's a key part of what makes him so terrifying as well. Patience is powerful. But this can often be quite a bit of a problem to deal with in stories. Constructing a character so cruel yet so smart that it seems impossible to actually outthink and defeat him. And when the heroes ultimately do, sometimes it's a bit unsatisfying because it feels like it only happened because the story needed it to. Genius characters have a tendency to get real dumb at the end of their arcs for some reason. However, Saint J. Garcia Saturn is an absolute masterclass of how to handle the downfall of a villain like this. And the way you do it is by having all of their actions add up to cause their own downfall. For every mercilessly cruel maneuver that Saturn implemented, he created an equally as grave mistake. And it all boils down to the core concept of hubris. I don't know if I've made this clear enough, but Saturn doesn't just consider himself to be a god. He is in fact a god of gods, because every world noble claims the title of god. However, Saturn sits above all except for the supreme being Emu. And that is a status that over the course of centuries has made Saturn feel infallible when it came to his decision making, because a god cannot be wrong, right? So let's take the raid on Onigashima for example. This was a decision made by all 5 elders, including Saturn, but they ordered CP0's Guernica to interrupt Kaido's fight and kill Luffy. And they did this in order to prevent what was referred to as the worst case scenario, which was Luffy awakening his devil fruit. However, by ordering Guernica to do this, the elders ended up facilitating that scenario. Because if Guernica had not interrupted the fight, it is very, very possible and even likely that Luffy would have lost to Kaido the same way that he did 3 previous times, and that the fruit would have remained dormant. The decision making of the 5 elders created one of their greatest problems. And this is a bit of a historical trend with the 5 elders as a whole, but let's look at Saturn's individual decisions. A very similar one would be the case of Jewelry Bonnie. As an infant, her devil fruit was given to her by Saturn as part of a sick experiment. One of the most overpowered devil fruits in the entire series, I should say, but one that Saturn could not see the value of. To Saturn, a fruit that lets you manifest any future you can think of is beyond worthless, because his mind couldn't comprehend anything except his supreme dominance over the planet. He, a god, couldn't imagine anything capable of beating him. So he assumed that certainly no insect could do it either, and so he gave away a key ingredient in his defeat. Secondly, stepping back 200 years ago, it was Saturn who made the decision not to destroy the Iron Giant Emmet, against Imu's command, I should say. This is a moment where Saturn thought he knew better than even the supreme being above him, and so in his hubris, Saturn thought that he could harness Emmet's power and use it as his own. But he couldn't, and Emmet went on to become another major factor in Saturn's defeat on Egghead Island. But the final major factor was our protagonist, Monkey D. Luffy, a boy who Saturn had previously awakened the devil fruit of thanks to the edict on Wano, but also Luffy wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for Saturn's torture of Kuma. The way I describe it is that Saturn thrust Kuma into a darkness so deep that it made the light of Luffy incredibly clear, obvious, and easy to find. It was through Kuma's travels as a warlord serving the world government that he discovered, kept track of, and ultimately assisted Luffy by sending the Straw Hats to their respective training islands. Now imagine, just for 1 second, if Saturn hadn't forcibly separated Kuma from Bonnie, or infected her, if Kuma's key focus in his life was just on being the best dad in the world, then he wouldn't have been on Sabaody that day. He also wouldn't have been on Thriller Bark a couple of days before, or keeping track of Luffy in the Goa Kingdom years before that. The Straw Hats would have been completely eradicated that day, and the last hope of the world would have been unceremoniously snuffed out. But it was Saint Saturn's insistence on being cruel to Kuma that created these opportunities. And at this point you have to ask, why? As a villain, Saturn's systematic destruction and torture of Kuma can be viewed with an almost admirable level of tenacity. However, one word that I would personally use to describe it would be petty. Saturn made a lot of very, very smart moves to accomplish his goal, but the goal itself was never a prize that he should have been playing for. Saturn's tunnel vision on subjugating this one buccaneer boy blinded him to the vulnerabilities that he himself was creating. Because while it did seem like a complete defeat for Kuma, who lost his mind and his body, his acceptance of Saturn's deal the moment that Kuma said thank you to the face of the devil was when Saturn was placed in checkmate. Because this is where evil completely and utterly failed to break good. And while it didn't save Kuma himself, it would go on to save the world at large. And the blind spots of Saturn's unique cruelty would all emerge and collide on Egghead Island. The awakening of Luffy's devil fruit, the subsequent use of Bonnie's devil fruit, Emmet's literal awakening, and most unpredictably of all, the shell of Bartholomew Kuma showing up of its own accord after being transformed into what was thought to be the ultimate slave, still managing to exercise free will, even after all of Saturn's best efforts to strip Kuma of everything that made him human. And as a result, Kuma punching Saturn is one of, and arguably the most satisfying in the series to date. And part of that satisfaction is because Saturn did this to himself. Stop hitting yourself, Saturn, because his entire career is one of failure. It just took time, a lot of time, for that failure to catch up with him. Just as I praise Saturn as a villain for invoking the power of patience, that is exactly what we needed to defeat him. Not days, not years, not just decades, but centuries of patience is what it took to bring Saint Saturn down, and I find that to be an incredibly satisfying mountain to conquer. And to top it all off, Saturn's exit from the series is one of the most impactful that we've ever seen, with all of his assorted hubris or hubri coming back to drain him of his immortality as Imu punishes him and rids the world of Saturn in one of the most gruesome and painful deaths in One Piece, which of course gives a lot of satisfaction satisfaction to readers and watchers. Very few people ever die in One Piece, whether they're good or bad, it just doesn't seem to matter. But what does matter is that one of the rare people who has been killed on screen is certainly one of the people who deserved it the most. And in the end, our last shot of Saint Saturn shows us nothing but his unremarkable and undeniably human skeleton, reducing what was once a timeless god to the very dust that is the fate of all of us fragile mortal beings. And so for the ultimate placement of Saint Saturn on this list, I'm not sure if there's ever been a more obvious S tier. Everything about Saturn was so satisfying to me. He was a fearsome antagonist who expanded the depth of darkness in One Piece, who was undone in a logical manner befitting his core character flaw, and provided an exceptionally engaging and disturbing experience throughout. I think the only negative thing I can say for Saturn is that his fight against Luffy did get a bit hopeless. There was a point where Saturn became quite useless in the effort to overcome Luffy's Gear 5th, so he doesn't have the most satisfying of fights of major antagonists, but even that flaw led us to the summoning of the other 4 elders, so I'm not gonna hold that against him, and even if I did, it's nowhere near enough to knock Saturn down in any significant way. So welcome to Club S, good sir, but you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next. This is York. She's 2 years old, can reach a maximum BMI of 600, and has spent most of her time on this planet as a professional toilet. A very greedy toilet who betrayed us for her ambition of becoming a world noble, and in doing so, York orchestrated one of the most impactful incidences in One Piece world history. But the big question I have with York is, how does she stack up to all of the not hers? Well, we're going to find out, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the hungry hippo herself, York. So first up, let's clarify exactly what York is. York is one of 6 Vegapunk satellites, an eclectic mixture of clones and machines, which Dr. Vegapunk created in order to separate certain parts of his humanity to create a more efficient workflow. And within York, Vegapunk decided to store all of his concentrated greed. Probably not a great idea from the world's smartest man, but let's see how it works out for him. Oh well. As mentioned before, York is 2 years old, but she's biologically 16, which is interesting to consider, because generally we mortals have no control over our age. However, Vegapunk did. He popped out all of his satellites at the exact age he wanted them to be. So York is 16, Atlas is also 16, Edison is somehow 18, Lilith is 24, Pythagoras is 26, and Shaka is 30. So not only did Vegapunk create a being out of pure greed, but he also made that being a teenager, the most volatile of all of the human existences. However, York is introduced as the most underwhelming Vegapunk. Whilst everyone else is busy inventing and testing things to revolutionize existence as we know it, York's role was to serve some more basic mechanical needs. When Edison starts to feel hungry while working, he asks York to eat. When Pythagoras needs to go to the bathroom, he asks York to do it for him. She also sleeps for them, all of them. And this process has an official name known as the EPS cycle, eat, poop, sleep. And it shouldn't be ignored that York's existence is probably a dream scenario for Eiichiro Oda himself. As a man who mostly wants to do nothing except sit and draw his story, the idea of having someone who could serve as a surrogate for his physical needs is nothing but a dream. But York is of course depicted as more dopey than the rest of the satellites, at least initially, and being blonde probably doesn't help that initial impression either. But all of this was constructed to intentionally deceive us, because I love a good old-fashioned mystery. And the mystery genre in general is one that One Piece doesn't dip into too often, and I feel like it really should, because it always results in some very compelling storytelling, like the mystery of who shot Iceberg on Water 7, leading to the reveal of CP9. And this mystery aspect is where York absolutely excels. Her existence is engineered to place suspicion onto the other Vegapunks. Shaka, Edison, and Pythagoras in particular commanded a lot of suspicion from me because of how emotionally transparent they weren't. Edison and Pythagoras are mechanical existences, and Shaka always had a mask on, so their motives were always in question, because it was much harder to emote and empathize with them due to those barriers. However, on the other hand, we have Lilith, Atlas, and York, who are the complete opposite. They are always completely emotionally transparent, especially Lilith, who wasn't afraid of showing her aspect of evil, but it created the dynamic of the enemy you know versus the enemy you don't. So even though the traitor was likely somewhere among the 3 negative aspects, I felt much more comfortable around them because their cards were always face up on the table, or so I thought. Up until York was revealed, I was personally convinced that the the traitor was Edison. He is the aspect of thinking, and without any emotions to be bound to, I suspected that the logical conclusion he came to, in order to best facilitate the path of science, was to betray the Vegapunks. And look, in my defense, Shaka, Pythagoras, and Stella did not suspect York either. They 100% put all of the suspicion onto Lilith, although I did always say when I was doing these chapters weekly that the most surprising option would be York. And that's what Oda went with. It was a big bombshell. However, this sort of deception is always a huge gamble. The most left field option is always going to be the most surprising, but also the most difficult to logically justify. If you have a character who you have deliberately gone out of your way to make the least suspicious, then it takes that much extra work to make that reveal satisfying. Because mysteries are not easy to write. They are so difficult, and you need to perfectly balance out the culprit. If you've got them too much in the foreground, then the reveal feels too obvious, like, oh, it was the guy we've been spending all of our time with and who was really suspicious. Oh, Kel, surprise. But then again, on the other hand, if you have the culprit too obscured in the background, if you're hiding them too much, then it feels like, oh, that came out of nowhere and the writer failed to foreshadow it, as if the writer backed themselves into a corner and couldn't come up with a satisfying answer. And the more mysteries you consume, the harder it is to be fooled by subsequent mysteries. So it's one of the most difficult genres to write. However, I think that Oda nailed it with York. Right before York announced that she was the traitor, we see 3 things that make her reveal one of the hardest hitting moments of Egghead Island. The first is York shooting Shaka in the head. This headshot is brutal and visceral, especially by One Piece standards. The impact of the shot sending Shaka's head flying back and contorting the rest of his body to follow, the abundance of blood splattering and all of the everything. It was quite a moment, and it did a lot to build up the ominosity of this traitor. But the second is that we also see S-Snake stepping on Pythagoras' head, killing him as well. And S-Snake was obviously ordered to do that by the traitor, so by the time we know the traitor is York, we are carrying the weight of 2 dead Vegapunks with us. And finally, right before York comes out of the darkness, the One Piece narrator, the mysterious narrator, has a monologue. One of, if not the longest monologue that the narrator has had in the entire series to date. It lasts for about 3.5 pages, and it's an abridged telling of the events of how Egghead Island got to this point, but also informing us of what was about to happen in the future. The resolution of this incident the following day would inflict a kind of shock that the world never saw coming. And it's after that line that York emerges, which is extremely powerful because York, she is riding right on that hype created by the narrator. And it gives the impression that York is going to be a dark central figure in these shocking events, which she wouldn't really be, but we'll get to that. Because right now, on the back of those feelings, York's 2-page traitor reveal is so damn good. And it's drawn with the kind of intimidating art that's very unique to One Piece, because here Oda uses York's scale to perfection, as the shot of her squatting down to Stella is incredibly frightening. Because when York was on our side, a giant woman, that's just kind of fun. Like that time that Zoro got caught staring at her butt, which inspired an artist to draw York from Zoro's perspective at the time. Great use of scale for fun, wacky comedy. However, when York is against us, her size is overwhelming, especially because her casual pistol is the size of a tank cannon, but this is also a great physical representation of the weight of intelligence. In the grand scheme of things, York is not a physical threat. She even admitted that herself. But at the same time, she is one of the 7 smartest people on the planet. And given how badly everything has gone on Egghead to this point, with the loss of 2 Vegapunks, York is a physical incarnation of being crushed by superior intelligence and planning, something that a lot of arc antagonists in One Piece quite severely lack. And also remember that at the time, this was portrayed as if York had outsmarted all of the other Vegapunks, that she had successfully pulled this off right in front of them. Now, obviously, there's more to add to that, but contextually, this is one of the most powerful and memorable moments of Egghead Island. And after the full story is revealed, maybe not so much, but that doesn't take anything away from the moment itself. And there's also a panel on the far left of the final page of York's reveal where the illusion of perspective makes it look like York is taking a dump on Shaka's corpse, which I do admittedly find quite funny. But what I find a lot less funny is York's ambition, which is legitimately chilling and I think is the most well-written aspect of York. All of her actions made a disgusting amount of sense as soon as York stated that she wanted to become a world noble, because York's obsession with greed is essentially a feat of science, perhaps one that never should have been attempted, but her concentrated greed is an unnatural existence. However, the world nobles are a natural evolution of that greed. This group of people exist to do nothing except consume. They have no ambition beyond consumption. They're the result of generation after generation of entitlement, to the point where greed has become their sole culture. In many ways, the world nobles are actually a lot worse than York, York, because at the very least it's possible for York to be temporarily satisfied and briefly achieve a state of happiness. And we apparently have a metric for this as well, as York is capable of consuming food to the extent of having a body mass index of 600, where a normal BMI is anywhere from 18.5 to 24.9. So there is a pretty hard limit to her consumptive capabilities. It takes a long time to get there, but once that limit is hit, York enters a zone of bliss where she can briefly forget about her desire altogether. But the one thing you'll notice about the world nobles is that they are never happy. Even when they get exactly what they want, exactly when they want it, they are still miserable. Because the entire universe itself would not be enough to satisfy the greed of even a single world noble. And if you want to think of it this way, the great tragedy of York is that she thinks that becoming a world noble, one of them, is going to satisfy her, but it won't. Once she gets there, all she's going to realize is exactly how much she doesn't have, and she'll then be tortured by greed for however long she happens to exist. And one of the more fascinating ideas that Oda poses to us is the danger of greed over violence and evil, because Atlas and Lilith were also satellites created to store Vegapunk's negative traits, and yet both of them were loyal to a fault, and greed was the only aspect to fall. One way of thinking about it is that evil, at the very least, has some understanding of the concept of morality, at least enough to know that it stands on the opposite end of the spectrum. But greed has no concern with intangible concepts like that, and it's an interesting message that we should be less afraid of the idea of evil and more concerned with the basic human faults that can lead someone down the path to eventually being described as evil, which is a lesson that the Vegapunks do learn over the course of Egghead thanks to York. As mentioned before, Shaka, Stella, and Pythagoras all initially labeled Lilith as the traitor with no investigation simply due to her having the label of evil, which is Oda saying be careful of judging people by labels given to them by others, which is something that we frequently encounter in regards to Luffy. In the eyes of everyone who's never met him, he is a sinister, chaotic, and very evil pirate. And the idea that greed is the one that betrays all of the others is so perfect. Because of course greed doesn't want to share its existence with 6 other people. And it does bring up a lot of uncomfortable questions, because York isn't some uniquely horrible person. She is the manifestation of the latent greed within Dr. Vegapunk himself. She is a core portion of the best and brightest that humanity has to offer, which shows that even our best can be corrupted if they embrace greed too heavily. Any one of us has the potential to produce a York. And I think because of that, she hits very conceptually hard as an antagonist, but the reveal and the motivation are where I unfortunately think that York peaked, because she has a very unconventional antagonistic arc. As after her reveal, we receive a mid-arc time skip, which is extremely odd and very rare in and of itself, but after we return from this time skip, York has already been defeated, and she spends the remainder of the arc in a state of stagnation. I love the ideas that York poses, they're very fun to think about, but also this is a shonen manga, and the antagonist is always going to lose points if they don't do a lot of, antagonistic things that we get to see. For most of the time we spend with York, she's meant to be disarmingly pleasant, and the second that York is revealed to be the villain, we skip to a point in time where she's been defeated and miss out on the main meat of what a shonen villain is meant to provide. Because One Piece is a battle manga, which means that it tells its story, it evolves its characters through battles, and York didn't get any battles to evolve. Again, York admits that she isn't strong enough to defeat anyone in chapter 1079, which is fantastic self-awareness, and not a lot of villains have that, but it's not an amazing admission to help build her commanding presence. But what we also need to contextually understand is that York was in a no-win situation the moment that she was created by Oda. And that's because the big problem with York is that she does not provide an escalation. You can't go from beating 2 Emperors of the Sea on Wano to creating a genuinely compelling story with York as the main antagonist. The Straw Hats have simply beaten too many people well above her caliber at this point. And I would say that probably Doflamingo was the cutoff point for someone like York to really work as an arc antagonist. After Doflamingo, you can't go back down, only up. And that's why I think that Oda was actually extremely wise to have the night on Egghead Island play out off screen, because there is nothing that he could have drawn that would really be worth our time in a post-Wano series. So it was much better to just cut straight to the action involving Kizaru and the 5 elders in order to get that escalation. Phenomenal story move, not a great move for York herself, because there are points during that second half of Egghead Island where I forgot that she was even there, and she was incapacitated for most of it as well. But also the structure of Egghead Island itself was very, very unfair to York, because as the arc was unfolding, we were consistently cutting to events all over the world, like Shanks versus Kid, Blackbeard versus Law, Garp on Hachinosu, Sabo's Reverie flashback, Kuma's flashback, and all of these events that were overshadowing what was actually happening happening right here on Egghead. Again, a fantastic story move, because this was easily the most exciting arc I have ever read on a weekly basis, but that does come with its victims. In fact, the very next thing that happened after York was revealed as the traitor was Eustace Kid versus Shanks on Elbaf. So she really got no time at all to bask in her role before Shanks took everyone's attention away from her. And this leads us to the biggest problem that I have with York in this role, which isn't her fault, but it's what I like to call Caesar syndrome. I had a very unfavorable view of Caesar Clown as a main antagonist because he kept getting one-upped by other villains in his own arc. Virgo performs the role better, the promise of Doflamingo incoming made me care a lot less about Caesar, and the idea of Luffy and Law forming an alliance to bring down Kaido made Caesar seem woefully insignificant, like he was just an annoying roadblock. And York is a very similar concept times about 1 billion, because York's role gets usurped by Kizaru, then that role gets usurped by Saint Saturn, which then gets usurped by all of the 5 Elder Old Men, and it gets to the point where, again, I just kind of forgot that York was even there. What we have on Egghead Island is a staircase of antagonists, and York is an odd one because she is made to be a step to reach the higher tiers. But not only that, York isn't even really the first step. That would probably be Rob Lucci. So of this 5-step stair thing, York fits somewhere in the lower middle. York is step 2, and who even cares about step 2? Step 1, at least you remember that because it's the first one that happened, but 2? No. And if we look at the current makeup of the villain tier list, what really does not help York at all is that Rob Lucci, Kizaru, and Saint Saturn have all been rated as S-tier villains, and they're all part of the arc where York is directly compared to each and every one of them. But I also think that Eiichiro Oda has made our job here quite simple, because the mystery leading up to York was fantastic. The ideas behind her were brilliant, but for the part where she actually had to serve as a villain, you know, the part that was almost completely skipped, we just don't have anything to rank. I will say that I think she did better than Caesar because at least York has her iconic traitor moment, and there's nothing detrimental about her. It's just that Oda didn't even give her the opportunity to prove herself, so I think a D tier is pretty fair. But you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next. This is Smoker, a dual cigar-wielding Logia overlord of the East Blue and Alabasta era of One Piece, a man who was at one point the greatest threat in the series, and the second character after Shanks to recognize exactly what Luffy would go on to become, and Smoker's mission to stop that becoming is what would characterize the rest of his time in One Piece. But as the primary antagonist of the Logtown arc, I have this desire to compare him to others, because our mission is to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring a man whose canonical hobbies are gambling and ceramic craft work, Smoker. It's quite a lovely hobby, really. But Smoker, he is a fascinating case because he's made me realize a thing, which is that in this world, which is mainly focused on a clash of ideology between pirates and marines, in this world, Smoker is only one of 3 marines who has ever been given the role of primary antagonist of any arc, with the other 2 being Kizaru and Sakazuki. So to be completely fair to Smoker's philosophy that we'll go on to explore, the bad guys usually are the pirates, and One Piece is a series of almost exclusively pirate-on-pirate violence. But our Smoker is first seen as a teaser at the end of chapter 97 where he's whinging about Toshigi and how she's an insufferable woman, rah. And that, it doesn't give us a whole lot to work with. And I will say it's quite unconventional for Oda to give an antagonist this really sort of mundane teaser intro. Usually it's much more dramatic. However, that's because Smoker is immediately meant to stand apart as a different breed of antagonist. Smoker's proper full introduction happens in chapter 98, and we are introduced to him stacking stones, which is part of a practice creatively known as rock stacking, a practice which has no defined purpose. Some people rock stack as an artistic expression, others do it almost as a meditative exercise, and there's even a brand of those who do it as an engineering exercise, to see what they can build out of rocks and rocks alone and how long it can remain a solid structure for. However, in Smoker's case, I think this very simply represents his drive for balance and stability, his own personal quest for justice as the latest rock in a very precariously balanced system. And something I like is that his stack does end up falling, which foreshadows the end of Logtown, with the system failing and chaos succeeding, but also the breakdown that Smoker's character would go on to experience throughout the rest of One Piece. Again, he is the latest stone in a stack of defenders of justice. And Smoker himself often goes on to not only question, but actively disturb the balance of this structure where he sees fit. And I should mention that Oda also gives Smoker the classic One Piece antagonist silhouetted face at the bottom of this page, which is Oda's essential visual language language that this character should be viewed as an ominous threat. And this is also a very early example of an Oda subversion, because later on in this chapter, an innocent little girl with a precariously balanced ice cream runs into Smoker, and he looks at her with a scarily silhouetted face. And what we've been conditioned to expect at this point is imminent violence or verbal abuse, Helmeppo style. Because that's what happened with, yes, Helmeppo, but also Alvida, Morgan, Buggy, Kuro, Krieg, Arlong, and others, probably others. But instead, Smoker apologizes for his pants having eaten the little girl's ice cream, and he gives her some money to buy an even bigger ice cream. And it's from this moment on that Smoker carves out a very defined space in the hearts of readers and watchers. He may be against us. In fact, he's definitely against us, and I know that we're going to have to fight him, but I'm still kind of on his side. Which makes Smoker the first complex antagonist we encounter in One Piece. And he's a good example of why I need to use the word antagonist instead of villain in these videos, as he's the first antagonist we meet who is not a villain. Smoker's not a bad guy by any means, and in a different world, and you know what, perhaps even later on in this one, he would be an instant ally, and the only thing that stops him from doing so is his profound philosophical belief that piracy is a paramount threat to justice and stability, which is why Smoker is merciless towards pirates. He's the kindest man in the world to any random citizen who has any random issue, but as soon as you associate yourself with filthy piracy, a switch flips. And this is a personality switch that comes quite close to the concept of absolute justice. The key difference being that Smoker will do absolutely anything to apprehend a pirate unless it requires harming or sacrificing an innocent life, which is what I like to call the Meatloaf dilemma, taken from his lyrics, "I'd do anything for love, but I won't do that." Smoker will do anything for justice, but he won't do that. And here's a very cool thing about Smoker that often goes under the radar. Initially, he actually sees Zoro as an ally, which is quite unusual. Most people who hear Zoro's name, no matter where they are on the justice spectrum, view Zoro as an entity to be afraid of. But because Zoro was known as a bounty hunter, Smoker's initially glad that he showed up at the execution platform incident in Logtown. Bounty hunters hunt criminals, so Smoker's all on board with Zoro at first. So he initially has this very black and white view of justice that Luffy and Zoro later on in Alabasta are slowly going to break down. But speaking of, the most compelling part of Smoker's tenure as an antagonist is his specific motivation to capture Luffy, and this spawns from Luffy smiling when he almost gets executed by Buggy, which triggers Smoker's memory of the execution of Goldie Roger, who also smiled upon death. And from here, Smoker rapidly puts together the hypothesis that Luffy is subject to the same degree of fate that Roger was. So to Smoker, Luffy isn't just another stain to be wiped off the toilet bowl. Nah, Smoker sees Luffy as a Roger level threat in the making, all the way back in Logtown. And from Smoker's perspective, everything needed to be dropped to stop Luffy before he reaches that eventuality. And even though Smoker is far more physically powerful than Luffy at the time, Smoker sees Luffy as a bigger problem than even Dragon, who Smoker does meet during Logtown, and as a man who actively helped Luffy. And also, Smoker is a very rare case of where anime filler actually enhances a character, because the anime shows Child Smoker witnessing Roger's execution, with Roger even smiling at Smoker as he's marched past him. In general, I do think that a lot of One Piece events are wisely left off screen. I think they're much more powerful in the imagination. But to me, this scene really enhances that connection that Smoker has to the legacy of Roger, as well as the incredible driving force he has to prevent another Roger from ever emerging. And you can also see Child Smoker at Roger's execution in the One Piece live action, among many other characters, which is very fun. But back to Logtown, this Smoker, he is the man who sees the gremlin on the plane. He knows what's about to happen, but to everyone else, he sounds like he's out of his mind. What gremlin, Smoker? What pirate king? What, the rubber boy? Oh, man. Which is why after Luffy escapes, Smoker packs up and pursues him into the Grand Line, both to take responsibility for failing to apprehend Luffy at Logtown, but also to very potentially save the entire world. And this becomes a key example of Smoker being willing to break the structure that he serves to uphold. Smoker was stationed at Logtown. Any marine activity outside of this is beyond his jurisdiction, but he disobeys superior officers to pursue his own belief in justice, which is incredibly admirable and only makes me like him more. And from here, what we have right is Smoker serving as a strong sandwich threat, by which I mean what we're doing is we are making a story sandwich of the Alabasta flavor. You got your meat in the middle, that's Luffy and the Straw Hats, and then ahead of them, on top of the meat, we have the threatening bread of Crocodile, but then below them is the bottom bread of Smoker. So all throughout the Grand Line, there's this fantastic sense of danger both in front of and behind us, which is all thanks to a display of Smoker's powers during the Logtown arc. To continue Smoker's series of One Piece firsts, he's not only the first Logia-type Devil Fruit user we encounter, but he's also the first opponent that Luffy outright loses to. And the first reaction to Smoker's Logia powers, it's always the same. It's a stunned, how could we ever possibly defeat this? This is too strong. So it is an extremely strong start from Smoker. However, he's an extremely odd antagonist because he occupies that role in an arc designed to be both an epilogue of East Blue and a prologue to the Grand Line. And the nature of both of those devices is that neither are designed to tell a full story. A prologue sets up context for the story to come, so Smoker was never going to have a full traditional antagonist arc, and an epilogue is designed as a button for a story that's already been told. However, that was a story that Smoker wasn't a part of, all the East Blue stuff, so he really occupies a kind of limbo area. And in addition to that, the Logtown arc is only 5 chapters long, which is tied for the shortest arc in the series alongside Reverse Mountain, and within those 5 Logtown chapters, Smoker's only present for 3 and a bit. So he has no time at all to do much of anything, and quite frankly, I think it's a miracle that Smoker was actually able to make such an impact with the time that he does have. But after heading into the Grand Line, Smoker uncovers a bit of a conspiracy, a plot of Baroque works on Alabasta, and after setting sail to the desert island, he encounters Ace. And looking at this from Smoker's perspective, he must believe that he's the main character of the story. Smoker comes across a man destined to become the next pirate king who needs to be stopped. Then he uncovers a plot by a warlord of the sea to take over an entire kingdom and shortly thereafter the world. And now, in trying to stop both of those previous men, he has encountered a third man who is the 2nd Division commander of the strongest men in the world. Smoker's dealing with a lot of men here. And with very, very little support from the Marines because he ignored his orders. But what I like is that even though he probably knows that he can't beat Ace, Smoker's philosophy of pirate bad compels him to fight for justice anyway, and Ace even calls out this philosophy as a quote, dumb reason. And while Smoker does have a very brief and cool clash with Ace, this is the beginning of what I call comedy Smoker. This is where Oda puts a lot of effort into making Smoker significantly less threatening than he was at Logtown by doing wacky things like having Luffy slam into his back, spitting food at him, and going on not just 1 but 2 Benny Hill style chases through Alabasta, the second of which results in both Luffy and Smoker being captured by Crocodile. And this is the real turning point for Smoker, but before we get to that, all of this comedy business is how you can tell that Oda is transitioning a character from antagonist to protagonist. What he does is he gradually makes them funnier, and much less threateninger overall, until they become someone that you'd happily invite over for dinner, which for the sake of this video makes our job a bit difficult because from here on out, Smoker isn't an antagonist. He's already had his run, and that run ended about halfway through Alabasta, where 2 things happened. The first is that the threat of Crocodile was discovered, a government-sanctioned pirate who was a more immediate threat to Alabasta than Luffy presented to the world. In fact, this is very cool, right? Because Smoker here, he essentially has his own version of Future Sight, because he also states that the moment that Nico Robin and Sir Crocodile joined forces, it wasn't just Alabasta that was in danger, but the entire world, which was true due to Crocodile's plan to obtain the ancient weapon Pluton, which isn't something that Smoker knew about. He could just see the vague picture of what may happen. The exact same thing that he did with Luffy at Logtown. But the other key thing that happened is that after being forced to spend time with Luffy in prison, Smoker started to be won over by Luffy. He learned about the motivations of the Straw Hats on Alabasta, their relationship with Nefertari Vivi, and Smoker's black and white worldview of piracy was challenged, particularly when Luffy ordered Zoro to save Smoker's life during the Rain Dinners incident. And now what I want to do is I want to put that into the Logtown Smoker perspective. Back in Logtown, Smoker initially thought that Zoro was his ally and Luffy was his enemy. But on Alabasta, Zoro was the one who would have let Smoker drown, and Luffy turned out to be the one who upheld Smoker's sense of justice. After which point, he lets the Straw Hats go and disappears from the climax of his own saga. Very, very interesting choice by Oda. The first time I went through One Piece, I have to say, I was a bit disappointed that only Tashigi showed up at Alabasta and Smoker was nowhere to be seen. However, when we do catch up with him after the battle, his absence is very satisfactorily explained, as he was the one who found Crocodile's dance powder ship, and it is heavily implied that Smoker was the one who used this illegal substance to conjure the rainfall on Alabasta that ended the Alabasta Civil War. It's a very Sanji kind of maneuver, to just disappear and implement something of grand importance. Although, I have to be clear here, it is never confirmed that Smoker use the dance powder, and he himself does deny it, but I personally believe that he did. And to cap everything off, when the world government want to credit Smoker as the man who beat Crocodile, in order to prevent glorifying piracy, of course, Smoker takes a stand and says one of my favorite lines in all of One Piece, which is, "Tell them to eat shit." This is Smoker's full circle moment. He started as a man who despised everything to do with piracy. It was an objectively evil concept to him. But now here Smoker is willing to accept and publicly tell the truth of his experience of piracy on Alabasta. Not that this went on to really change his mind about the future threat that Luffy represents. And I have to say, this is where we get into a bit of a disappointing run for Smoker, because most former arc antagonists have a lot of character growth following their stories of significance, but in Smoker's case, he very much stagnates. After Water 7, he and Tashigi doubled down on their determination to capture Luffy and Zoro in the New World. Then we have a return to threatening Smoker at Marineford, where Smoker again proves his strength superiority over Luffy, but Luffy proves his fate superiority with Boa Hancock stepping in to help him. But then after the time skip and the Straw Hats reform, Smoker drops everything to pursue Luffy, which, look, I have to admire the relentless dedication. From the very beginning, Smoker has seen Luffy's destiny and he's doing everything he can to stop it because it terrifies him. But post Alabasta, everything we see with Smoker is all stuff we've seen before. Punk Hazard era Smoker was definitely fun, but it was a bit of a repeat of Alabasta. He chased Luffy to an island, discovered a more imminent danger, got thrown in prison with Luffy, and worked together to solve the problem before parting ways as unwilling allies. And also on Punk Hazard, comedy Smoker makes a return in a big way, 2 big ways really, as he spends quite a bit of this arc trapped into Shiki's body thanks to Trafalgar Law, which, while hilarious, definitely diminishes any feeling that Smoker himself was ever a threat to us and plants him quite firmly in the lovable side characters basket. Again, the issue with post-time skip and even post-Alabasta Smoker for me is that he just hasn't evolved. We just keep replaying all of his Logtown and Alabasta character beats. And speaking of beats, mate, does Smoker get some of those. This is a channel meme at this point, but I have a specific artwork of Smoker all beat up because he is one of the reigning champions of losing fight battles, having lost to Trafalgar Law, Caesar Clown, Virgo, and Doflamingo all in the space of a single arc, which does further diminish that one very threatening aura that Smoker had long ago. And at this point, he and Tashigi feel a bit like a Team Rocket element of One Piece. They're this group that shows up every now and then to capture Luffy/Pikachu and end up failing with some wacky comedy elements and then blast off again until next time. He's a pretty unfortunate guy, really, because Smoker, the character, he is super intelligent. He can see everything that's about to happen on a scale that Katakuri and even Shanks could only dream of. But Smoker himself, he can never stop it. He was even the first person to identify what a threat to the planet that Caesar Clown could have been if his chemical weapons were allowed to leave the island. But Smoker himself couldn't do anything about it. It was only thanks to Luffy and Law that Caesar was able to be stopped. And I should also say that character stagnation, especially post-time skip, is not a Smoker exclusive criticism. You can definitely say the same thing about a lot of the Straw Hats as well. Like Smoker, a lot of them have settled into their Straw Hat archetypes with not a lot of change and growth. But unfortunately for Smoker, this is the villain tier list, and the vast majority of One Piece villains do undergo a surprising amount of continuous growth. And Smoker's already in a weird position where he started out as such a compelling, impactful antagonist during Logtown, but fizzled out and disappeared during Alabasta. And from then onwards, all Oda really did was put on Smoker's greatest hits for when he appeared again. He does still have a very key role in the story going forward though. Smoker's most recent appearance saw him returning from a very special mission carrying a box that I would describe as quite poneglyph shaped. And so whatever that is, I'm sure it's going to be a big deal. And it'll probably do a lot for Smoker as a character. But strictly speaking as a villain, I don't think anything in the future is going to change his impression today. And this may sound unfair, but I do think that Smoker is a D tier villain. Probably an A tier character in general, maybe B-, but he transitioned out of the role of antagonist as quickly as he was introduced as one, and he is really only part of this video series as a technicality, but you let me know which antagonist you would like to see ranked next.